Hello there and welcome to Physics with William, where curiosity gets comfortable and science is allowed to slow down a little. Tonight I want to talk about something that sounds impossible at first and then, once it settles in, becomes a little hard to shake off. We're going to spend some time with the speed of light. Usually it arrives in a documentary as the hero of the story, the ultimate speed limit, the great champion of the universe, the thing so absurdly fast that human language tends to give up and start making dramatic hand gestures. Light circles the Earth in a blink. It reaches us from the sun in just a few minutes. It turns the night sky into a kind of instant message board from the cosmos, even if the messages are often embarrassingly out of date. And yet, for all of that, I want to suggest something much less flattering. The speed of light is not fast, not in the way we really need it to be, not if the universe is as large as it appears to be, not if distance is measured in spans so huge that even light spends years, centuries, millennia and longer just trying to cross the room. On human scales, light is outrageously quick. On cosmic scales, it is painfully slow, slow enough to keep worlds apart, slow enough to make almost every star unreachable in any meaningful sense, slow enough to turn the universe from a grand open frontier into something much colder and much stranger. A place of separation, a place where distance is not just inconvenient, but fundamental. Before we get too far into that cheerful little bedtime thought, I would love to know where you are listening from tonight and what time it is where you are. It feels oddly appropriate for a conversation like this, a video about cosmic isolation, and yet here we are, spread out across cities and countries and time zones, somehow meeting in the same moment anyway. There is something nice about that. Small, local, human. Very much the opposite of intergalactic travel. And if you enjoy this sort of quiet detour into the bigger questions, the ones that sound dramatic but are really just physics wearing a serious face, then do consider liking the video and subscribing. It helps this small corner of the internet find other people who also enjoy winding down with ideas that are only mildly existential. I do hope this is soothing. I also accept that saying the universe may be a prison built out of distance is not the most traditional route to relaxation, but let us see how it goes. Now then, when most of us hear the phrase speed of light, we hear finality. We hear the fastest thing there is, the cosmic record holder, the unbeatable limit, and all of that is true as far as physics goes. Nothing with mass can be pushed through space faster than light and vacuum. That much seems to be written into the rules. So the common reaction is reasonable enough. If the universe has given us a maximum speed, and that speed is so large that it defeats our imagination, perhaps the cosmos is still conquerable. Difficult, yes. Inconvenient, certainly, but not closed. Not truly closed. That hope depends on a very human mistake. We judge speed by the scales we know. A car is fast compared with the walking. A jet is fast compared with a car. Light is fast compared with everything we have ever built. So we instinctively assume that the fastest possible thing must also be fast enough. Fast enough for a galaxy. Fast enough for the stars. Fast enough for a future civilization with better engines and more confidence than we currently possess. We tell ourselves that the universe is large but still navigable, and that our real problem is one of technology. We need bigger ships, better fuels, stronger materials, cleverer mathematics, perhaps a motivational speech or two. Once we solve those, off we go. Physics is less encouraging. The problem is not simply that the universe is big. It is that it is big in a way that does not care about aspiration. It is big in years, in thousands of years, in millions of years, in spans of time that do not merely exceed a human lifetime but erase entire civilizations. We tend to talk about distance as though it were a matter of length, but in the universe, distance is also delay. Every gap is a weight. Every horizon is a sentence handed down by geometry and time. If something is far away, then even the fastest signal the universe allows will arrive late, not a little late, ridiculously late. often so late that the thing you wanted to know may already have changed beyond recognition by the time the answer gets back to you. That begins to alter the emotional meaning of space. A mountain far away is still part of your world. A city across the ocean is still part of your world. Another continent may be difficult to reach, but it belongs to the same present. If something important happens there, you can hear about it quickly. If you choose to travel, you can do so within a timescale that still feels like one life, one history, one shared moment of civilization. Even when distances are large on Earth, they are not large enough to break reality into separate eras. We still live together in the same now. Space does not offer that courtesy. Look up at the night sky, and the stars seem immediate. That is part of the trick. Vision makes distance feel conquered. If you can see it, it feels close in some primitive part of the mind. But the stars are not close. Even the nearest one beyond the sun is so far away that light takes years to get here, which means when you see it, you are not seeing it now. You're seeing a delayed report. You're always receiving old news. The universe is not a live broadcast. It is an archive arriving one piece at a time, and even that can sound manageable until you begin stacking the numbers properly. Years to the nearest star. Longer to almost anything else of interest. Tens of thousands of years just to move around substantial parts of a galaxy, if you're using the fastest thing nature permits as your messenger, and not a lumbering spacecraft. Suddenly the word neighbourhood starts to feel dishonest. Suddenly the phrase galactic civilization begins to sound like something that would require not just engineering, but a total rewrite of what any sensible being should mean by contact, community, or travel. There is also another layer to the problem, and this one is especially unfriendly. The universe is not standing still while you try to cross it. Space itself is changing. Galaxies are receding. The whole large-scale structure is stretching. So the prison is not made merely of distance. It is made of distance that grows, of destinations that can slip away while light is still on the road. There are regions so remote that no signal sent today will ever reach them. Not because the signal is weak, not because the sender lacks resolve, but because the structure of the cosmos refuses delivery. That is not an engineering problem. That is a locked door. This is where the usual language of exploration starts to sound a little too optimistic. We inherited an image of the future from ships, maps, frontiers, aircraft, rockets, and all the other machines that turned once impossible distances into routine journeys. Cross the sea, cross the continent, cross the sky, reach the moon. The pattern seems clear. What was once fantasy becomes logistics. Give it time. Build better tools, expand the circle. There is a lot to admire in that story. It is one of the better habits our species has developed. But it also tempts us into assuming that every barrier is temporary. Every limit just waits for a more advanced civilization to arrive with good engineering and a slightly smug expression. That works right up until physics says no, not no for now, no in principle. And it is worth taking that no seriously, because it changes the tone of the universe. A universe with no fundamental speed limit would be strange in many ways, but it would at least remain open. In principle, any place could eventually become part of the same active world. Knowledge could spread fast enough to stitch enormous distances into one living network. Cause and effect could still bind the whole thing together on useful timescales. Civilizations separated by stars might still become neighbours in more than a poetic sense. The cosmos would be vast but not fundamentally fragmented. Our universe is different. It has a maximum speed, and that speed is too slow for the size of the stage. That means every civilization, if there are others, grows up inside its own bubble of practical reality. It sees only a limited region in useful time. It can affect only a limited region in useful time. It can dream about the rest, study the rest, maybe even worship the rest, but touching it is another matter. There may be intelligence elsewhere, art elsewhere, history elsewhere, entire chains of triumph and failure and ordinary domestic nonsense unfolding under distant suns. and almost all of it will remain separate not because life is rare, but because causality is slow. That is a harder thought than the old lonely universe idea. People often imagine cosmic loneliness as a question of numbers. Are we alone or not? Is there anyone else out there? But even a crowded universe can be isolating if contact is functionally impossible. A city full of locked apartments is not less lonely because many people are present behind the walls. In fact, in some ways that is worse. The tragedy is not emptiness. The tragedy is separation. Light, for all its brilliance, enforces that separation. It does not do so maliciously, of course. Physics has no mood about it. But the effect is the same. Light is the fastest carrier of influence, information, and warning. If it is late, then everything is late. Discovery is late. Rescue is late. Conversation is late. Coordination is late. Even simple awareness arrives after the fact. And as distances rise from planetary to stellar, to galactic to cosmological, the delay stops feeling like travel time and starts feeling like exile. There is a reason science fiction spends so much effort trying to cheat this limit. Wormholes, hyperspace, jump drives, folded dimensions, strange tunnels, convenient ancient portals left behind by wiser beings. It is not just because those ideas are fun, though they are. It is because the writers understand the problem. If you keep the real speed limit, most grand empires and lively interstellar politics become awkward very quickly. The geography of the universe resists narrative. It resists immediacy. It resists the kind of shared present that stories like to have. So fiction cheats, because otherwise the stars do not become a stage for adventure. They become a lesson in delay. And to be fair, there is still wonder in delay. A great deal of wonder. Astronomy itself depends on it. To look far away is to look back. We see ancient light, old galaxies, earlier states of the universe. We reconstruct cosmic history, not by travelling through time, but by waiting for time to arrive encoded in photons. That is extraordinary. It is one of the finest things science has ever realised. But even here, the same principle holds. The universe reveals itself to us through lateness. Knowledge comes by delay because delay is built in. Human beings are not especially good at living inside that fact. We are creatures of near space and short time. We evolved in an environment where important causes usually announce their effects promptly. A rustle in the grass meant something nearby. A storm on the horizon would be here soon enough. A friend calling your name was not speaking from 4 years ago. Our intuitions were trained in a local world where feedback loops are quick, and the present is genuinely shared. So when we look out into the cosmos, our minds carry those expectations with them. We imagine that enough power can shrink distance into inconvenience. We imagine that seeing something means being in a meaningful relation with it now. We imagine that if only we survive long enough and become clever enough, the universe will eventually behave like a larger version of home. It will not. The stars are not cities separated by longer roads. They are more like islands separated by time itself. And once you scale up beyond stars, even islands sounds too friendly. Whole galaxies drift beyond practical reach. Whole regions of the cosmos are already outside the possibility of mutual exchange. The map keeps existing, but the routes do not. At that point, the word frontier becomes misleading. Frontiers imply movement, settlement, return, contact, trade. They imply a continuity of history. Much of the universe does not allow that continuity. It allows observation. In some cases, it may allow one-way influence. In a precious few local cases, it may allow travel that matters, but most of it remains partitioned. This is not the kind of idea that usually appears in cheerful posters about the future. We prefer futures with gateways opening, not horizons hardening. We prefer expansion, connection, growth, abundance. And some of those may still happen on smaller scales. A planetary civilization could become an interplanetary one. A stellar system could perhaps be explored in detail. Nearby stars may one day be visited by machines, possibly by descendants of ours, if our descendants are very patient and remarkably determined. None of that is ruled out. What is ruled out is the fantasy that the cosmos as a whole is waiting to be knitted together into one active conversational domain. Physics does not support that dream. The distances are too large, the limit is too slow, and the universe itself is not making the job easier. So when I call the speed of light a prison, I do not mean that it traps us in some dramatic science fiction cage with glowing bars and a stern robot guard. I mean something quieter and more complete. It defines the size of a causally connected life. It sets the maximum rate at which anything important can propagate. It tells every civilization, every species, every signal this far and no faster. You may look beyond your reach. You may think beyond your reach. You may build instruments to study what lies beyond your reach, but reach itself is rationed. That is a strange thing to realize in a species that has spent centuries believing that limits exist to be broken. Sometimes they do. Many of them should be. Illiteracy can be broken. Disease can be broken. Ignorance can be reduced. Hunger can be reduced. Brutal political arrangements can be dismantled. Technical barriers can fall one after another. Human history contains many real triumphs over constraints that once felt natural and permanent. That is one reason the cosmic speed limit bothers us so much. We're used to limits retreating. We're not used to being told that one of the deepest barriers is not waiting for the next breakthrough. It is part of the structure. And perhaps that is why the topic feels a bit personal, even though it concerns galaxies and horizons and unimaginably old light. It presses against a very ordinary hope, the hope that enough ingenuity can turn every far thing into a near thing, the hope that the universe is open in the same way our maps once opened, the hope that time itself will eventually be made to cooperate. But the more closely we look, the more the opposite seems to be true. Distance is not just large, it is active. Delay is not just annoying, it is constitutive. Light is not just fast, it is the jailer of every exchange the universe permits. And once you start seeing that, even familiar objects begin to look slightly different. The moon is no longer simply close, it is close with delay. The sun is no longer immediate. It is a star whose image is already old when it reaches your eyes. The nearest stars are not shining companions but remote beacons from years ago. One by one, the universe starts to reorganize itself, not as a set of places, but as a set of waiting times. That, I think, is where the real story begins. Not with a dramatic declaration that everything is impossible, because that would be too simple and not entirely true. There is still motion, still exploration, still astonishing science to be done. But before any of that, we need to correct our instincts. We need to take the grand champion of speed and place it against the actual size of the arena. Only then does the scale of the problem become clear. Only then does the universe stop looking like open water and start looking like a set of locked rooms connected by messages that arrive absurdly late. And the fastest way to feel that for yourself is not to leap straight to distant galaxies, but to begin much nearer to home, with places that seem close enough to touch until you ask how long light actually takes to make the trip. It helps to begin with an uncomfortable question. When we say that light is fast, what exactly are we comparing it to? Usually we are comparing it to ourselves, to cars, trains, aircraft, rockets, drifting clouds, falling rain, spoken words, and the rest of the slow machinery of ordinary life. Against those things, light is not merely fast, it is absurd. It covers distances that would take us hours, days, or years in what feels to us like nothing at all. By the standards of daily experience, it may as well be instant. That is why it earns such a grand reputation. It defeats every familiar benchmark without even seeming to try. The trouble begins when we quietly smuggle that human impression into the universe at large. We take a speed that is overwhelming on the scale of one planet and assume it must remain overwhelming on every larger scale. That is the mistake. It is not a foolish mistake. In fact, it is exactly the kind of mistake a human mind would make, because our intuitions were not built for cosmic distances. We did not evolve in a galaxy. We evolved on a small rocky surface with a thin atmosphere, short horizons, and practical concerns. For creatures like us, anything that goes around the world in a blink sounds like it should be enough for anything. But the universe is under no obligation to honour that feeling. There is a large difference between being the fastest thing available and being fast enough for the problem at hand. That difference shows up all the time in ordinary life. The fastest runner in a village is still not fast enough to outrun winter. The fastest ship in an old harbour is still not fast enough to cross an ocean by lunchtime. The fastest message in an earlier century was still not fast enough to prevent events that were already unfolding somewhere far away. Being the best available option does not automatically make something sufficient. It only makes it the least inadequate. That is a harsher way of describing light, but on cosmic scales it is the honest way. On Earth, distance and delay can usually be bullied into submission. We build faster vehicles, better roads, stronger engines, cleaner routes. We shrink the world a little more with each technical improvement. There are still delays, of course, but most of them feel negotiable. If something is too far to reach by foot, perhaps it is near enough by car. If it is too far by car, perhaps it is manageable by aircraft. A journey that once took months becomes a routine inconvenience. The pattern becomes familiar enough that it starts to feel universal. Faced with a large gap, our first instinct is not to ask whether the gap is fundamentally impassable. Our instinct is to ask what tool we have not invented yet. That instinct is one of our strengths, but it can also turn into a kind of optimism that physics does not share. Once the distances become large enough, even the best possible messenger becomes slow in a way that no cleverness can completely erase. This is the part that takes time to settle in. Light is not slow because it is failing. It is slow because the universe is too big for any finite speed to feel generous. Consider how the phrase light year tends to sound in casual conversation. It is often used as a poetic stand-in for vastness. Something is light years away, and that is enough to make the point. But hidden inside the phrase is a quiet confession. A light year is not merely a long distance. It is a distance defined by how far even light can travel in an entire year. Not in a moment, not in a day, in a full year. The unit itself is already telling you that space has become time. It is telling you that travel and communication can no longer be separated from waiting. We hear the grandeur of the phrase and sometimes miss the warning built into it, and once the numbers move beyond 1 light year, the warning becomes much louder. A star a few years away is not simply distant. It is years out of date the moment you look at it. A destination 10 years away is not 10 years away only in the sense of mileage. It is 10 years away in conversation. Ask a question, and the earliest possible reply does not come in the same decade. That is not a technical inconvenience. That is a transformation of what contact even means. A community cannot function normally on those terms. A relationship cannot function normally on those terms. Even a simple exchange of information begins to take on the timescale of history rather than life. This is one reason space is so hard to think about honestly. We keep using words inherited from local life. Nearby, journey, visit, neighbour, signal, exploration. Those words carry emotional baggage from a small world. They suggest an eventual overcoming of delay. They suggest that enough patience and machinery can make distance manageable. But there comes a point where the delay is not something you work around. It becomes the main fact. The distance is no longer a road between two places. It is a separation between two different presents. That may sound dramatic, but it is really just a sober description of what finite information speed does in a very large cosmos. Imagine two societies separated by enough distance that even their fastest possible messages take generations to cross. Neither side can react to the other in anything like real time. Neither side can warn, coordinate, negotiate, or share experience in a way that belongs to ordinary living memory. They are not participating in one joint reality, even if they know the other exists. They are more like historians of each other, receiving fragments from earlier ages. and that is still a relatively friendly example, because it imagines that both sides remain stable, long enough to keep exchanging anything at all. The deeper problem is that time does not pause while messages travel. Civilizations rise and fall, worlds change, stars age, decisions become irrelevant, crises end, new crises begin. By the time one side learns what the other was worried about, that worry may have become ancient. By the time a greeting arrives, the culture that sent it may already have transformed beyond recognition. By the time help is requested, there may be nobody left who still needs the same kind of help. Speed matters not only because it determines whether something can arrive, but because it determines whether arrival still means anything. Human beings do understand this on a smaller scale. A warning that arrives after the accident is not a warning. A cure that arrives after the patient is gone is not a cure. A reply that arrives years after the question may still be interesting, but it is no longer part of the same living exchange. We grasp all that perfectly well in daily life. What we resist is applying the same logic to the stars. We want the cosmos to be grand but still accessible, difficult but not deeply closed. So we keep treating light as if its title of fastest thing in the universe should automatically spare us from cosmic irrelevance. It does not. In some ways, the phrase fastest thing in the universe is itself slightly misleading. Not because it is wrong, but because it encourages a kind of emotional overreaction. Fastest sounds triumphant. It sounds victorious. It sounds like a finish line has been crossed. But from another angle, it means that the universe has a strict upper ceiling on how quickly causality can move. Nothing faster is coming to rescue us from the consequences of scale. No hidden reserve exists just beyond our current engineering. No amount of technical maturity changes the rule. The maximum has already been stated, and the maximum is not enough to turn the universe into one connected arena. This matters because there is a difference between local openness and global openness. Locally, the universe may be full of possibilities. Worlds can be studied. Planets can perhaps be settled. Nearby space can in principle be explored with immense effort. There is room for bold projects, long futures, and astonishing achievements. None of that needs to be denied. But globally, the picture hardens. Most of the cosmos remains beyond the range where action and response can belong to the same meaningful time frame. Most of it is not waiting to join a common civilization. Most of it is simply out there, delayed beyond usefulness. That is why the speed of light begins to feel slow the moment you stop praising it and start depending on it. As long as light is only a marvel, its speed seems almost magical. It brightens the sky, carries images, powers technology, and ties the observable universe together in a broad scientific sense. But the moment you ask it to do practical work across large distances, its limitations become painfully visible. It is like inheriting the best postal service imaginable, and then realizing your correspondence lives so far away that each letter becomes an intergenerational artifact. The delivery system has not failed. The geography has. There is also a psychological trap here. We tend to imagine slowness as a personal experience. Waiting feels slow when we notice ourselves waiting. A week for a parcel feels slow. A month for a decision feels slow. A year for a project feels slow. But cosmic slowness is different. It is not simply the feeling of waiting. It is the structural inability to participate in distant events while they are still events. That makes it harder to picture. It is not just that light takes a long time. It is that by the time light gets there, the meaning of getting there may already have expired. This is why the universe can be visually available and practically inaccessible at the same time. We can see far more than we can touch. We can measure more than we can reach. Telescopes allow us to know an astonishing amount about remote objects, but that knowledge should not be mistaken for nearness. Observation is not entry. Awareness is not access. A star in a telescope can feel present to the mind while remaining hopelessly absent from the sphere of actual interaction. The distinction becomes even clearer when you compare space with landscapes on Earth. Looking at a mountain in the distance does not produce a fundamentally different temporal relationship. You can walk toward it, others can come back from it. News can travel from one side to the other inside the same historical afternoon if necessary. The mountain may be remote, but it belongs to one shared present. Distant stars do not. They belong to a different arrangement entirely. They are visible, yes, but visibility there is already delayed. The view itself is late. Once you accept that, light starts to lose some of its heroic glow. It remains extraordinary, of course. It remains central to almost everything we understand about the universe, but extraordinary is not the same as sufficient. In a cosmos measured in immense spans, sufficiency is a brutal standard. To be sufficient, a messenger would need to make distance matter far less than it does. It would need to keep separate places inside one coherent present. Light cannot do that except in very small neighbourhoods by cosmic standards. There is an irony here that I think makes the subject harder to forget. The same speed that feels almost instantaneous in daily life becomes a source of profound delay in astronomy. One reality does not cancel the other. They coexist. That is what makes the idea so unsettling. Light is fantastically fast. Light is hopelessly slow. Both statements are true, depending on what you're asking it to cross. Human beings live at the awkward boundary where both truths can be felt. We are small enough for light to seem godlike in ordinary life, yet curious enough to notice that the universe makes even godlike speeds look tired. And perhaps that is why so much popular language about the cosmos quietly exaggerates our potential. It is emotionally easier to speak of vast frontiers, open futures, and the conquest of distance than it is to admit that much of the universe is not awaiting conquest at all. It is simply too far away for conquest to mean anything. A frontier implies expansion into the same living world. A prison, even a very large and beautiful one, implies boundaries that remain boundaries no matter how energetically you resent them. None of this means the universe is devoid of adventure. It means the adventure is more local than our fantasies often allow. A species might spread across planets. It might reshape its home system. It might send patient machines toward neighbouring stars. It might build archives that outlast empires and observatories that read the history of the cosmos with astonishing precision. These are not small things. They would be immense accomplishments, but they remain different from the older dream of turning the galaxy, let alone the entire universe, into one traversable domain of ordinary traffic and lively conversation. The speed limit does not forbid greatness. It forbids a certain kind of closeness. That is the real reason the fastest thing in the universe feels slow. It is not because the speed itself is unimpressive. It is because scale can overpower even the maximum. When the stage becomes large enough, the champion becomes inadequate. When distances become measured in years of travel for light itself, speed begins to look less like liberation and more like a reminder. This is all you get. However ambitious you become, however advanced your machines grow, however long your future lasts, this is the rate at which influence spreads. And once you really hear that sentence, it changes the emotional shape of the cosmos. The night sky becomes less like a map of destinations and more like a record of separations. The stars are still beautiful. They are still worth studying. They may still someday be approached by means we can barely imagine. But they do not stop being remote in the deepest practical sense. Their remoteness is not an engineering embarrassment waiting to be corrected. It is a condition imposed by the size of the universe and the reluctance of light to do more than it already does. It may help to bring the scale back down again, because this is where the point becomes less philosophical and more physical. If the speed of light can feel slow even in places much nearer than the stars, then the whole argument stops sounding like cosmic melodrama and starts sounding like measurement. We do not have to begin with distant galaxies or with the edges of the observable universe. We can begin far closer, with something that hangs in our sky and feels almost companionable. It looks near enough to belong to human life, near enough that we have walked on it, named its seas, and built calendars around its motions. And even there, once you pay attention to the delay, you start to notice that the universe has been rationing immediacy from the very beginning. That is why the next place to look is the moon. The easiest way to make this problem feel real is not to begin with some distant galaxy or with the edge of the observable universe, but with something much closer, something so familiar that it barely feels astronomical at all. The moon is not an abstract destination. It is part of ordinary human life. It is in stories, calendars, poems, farming traditions, myths, holidays, sleepless nights, and childhood drawings. It is the first thing many people learn to recognize in the sky. It changes shape above us with such regularity that it seems almost domestic. Even now, after centuries of physics, after rockets and landings and orbiters and samples brought home in sealed containers, the moon still carries a strange double identity. It is both a real place and a presence, both a world and a companion. That is precisely why it helps here. The moon feels close. It is close, at least compared with every other substantial object beyond Earth. If the universe is ever going to give us a sense of immediacy beyond our own atmosphere, surely it should happen there. Surely that is where the delay should vanish into insignificance. Surely if light can feel fast anywhere in space, it ought to feel fast between Earth and the moon. And yet even here, at the smallest useful scale of true space travel, we do not get instant contact. We wait. The wait is short by human standards, but that is not really the point. The point is that there is a wait at all. That may sound too obvious to matter. Of course there is a delay. Every signal takes time. Everyone already knows that, at least in a vague way. But vague knowledge is different from actually living inside the consequence. Most people do not spend much of their day reflecting on the fact that when someone on the moon speaks to someone on Earth, the conversation cannot flow the way two people in the same room speak. There is a gap, a small, stubborn, physical silence imposed by distance itself. No cleverness removes it. No urgency negotiates with it. Even in the most intimate and achievable version of interworld communication, nature insists on pause. That pause matters because it changes the emotional texture of space. We're used to conversation being nearly immediate. A voice call across a city feels instant. A video call across an ocean is close enough to instant that the mind generously pretends the distance is gone. We've built a technological environment in which delay is often hidden from us, softened until it no longer feels like distance at all. That has made us slightly spoiled in a way that only modern humans can be. We are surrounded by systems that imitate simultaneity. Message sent, message received, question asked, answer given. Tap a screen and somewhere else in the world a device lights up. The whole arrangement encourages the illusion that information can outrun geography, or at least embarrass it into irrelevance. Then space quietly reminds us otherwise. The moon is not far in the grand cosmic sense, but it is far enough to break that illusion, far enough that speech becomes staggered, far enough that command and response no longer overlap naturally, far enough that even the nearest true world beyond Earth already belongs to a slightly different tempo. If one person speaks from Earth and another replies from the moon, they are not sharing a moment in the same fluid way that human beings normally mean when they talk. They're trading carefully spaced pieces of time. That is a very important threshold. It means the problem is not reserved for distant stars. The problem starts almost immediately, just beyond the edge of the familiar. It is worth lingering on that because the moon is often used in our imagination as the symbol of proximity in space. We say that a goal is not moonshot material when we want to suggest it is practical. We speak of lunar bases and permanent outposts as though they belong to the next stage of ordinary expansion. We picture astronauts at work there with a confidence that makes the whole project seem local, almost like an offshore platform with better public relations. There is truth in that. By cosmic standards, the moon really is local. That is why it is the perfect demonstration. If even local space introduces unavoidable delay, then the larger argument is no longer theoretical. It becomes built into the first rung of the ladder, and that ladder has very few rungs before the delays become absurd. But the moon gives us the gentlest possible version of the lesson. It does not yet punish us with years of waiting. It does not demand civilizations endure for centuries just to complete an exchange. It simply introduces a slight but undeniable hesitation. It says, very politely, if you wish to leave Earth behind, you must also leave behind the dream of perfect immediacy. Even here, in the safest and nearest corner of genuine space, cause and effect are no longer quite intimate. There is something almost theatrical about that delay. Anyone who has watched old recordings of lunar missions will know the strange rhythm it creates. A question is asked. Then there is a beat. Then the answer comes. That beat is distance made audible. It is one of the most honest sounds in spaceflight. Not the roar of launch, not the countdown, not the celebration after a landing, but the little gap between one voice and the next. You can hear space in that silence. You can hear the fact that Earth and Moon are not one place. They are connected, yes. Reachable, yes. But not merged. And even that tiny break is enough to complicate action. Real work depends on timing. Piloting, repair, medicine, coordination, safety, teaching, improvisation, argument, reassurance. All of it becomes subtly harder when replies do not arrive when instinct expects them. Human beings are extremely good at managing small delays once we know they are there, but the effort should not be mistaken for disappearance. The moon does not become near because we adapt. It remains distant, and adaptation is simply our way of coping with that fact. This is worth emphasizing because we have a habit of treating successful adjustment as proof that a barrier has been eliminated. If a problem can be managed, we talk as though it has vanished. Yet in space, the management often reveals the barrier more clearly. Procedures become more careful. Commands become more explicit. Teams become more disciplined about turn-taking. Redundancy increases. Autonomy becomes more important because immediate intervention is no longer available in the way we're used to on Earth. The very design of systems begins to absorb the distance. The moon is close enough that this all remains manageable, but it is already far enough that the structure of operations has to respect the weight. That is the first quiet hint that the prison of light is not only about spectacular impossibility, it is also about the reshaping of behavior wherever delay becomes part of the environment. Even at lunar distance, you do not simply extend Earth outward and expect everything to feel the same. You begin to create a different mode of living, one in which local decision-making matters more because outside help is not perfectly immediate. A machine breaks, and the person beside it matters more than the expert far away. A crisis unfolds and the people present must shoulder it before advice can arrive. This may sound minor at the scale of the moon, but it points directly toward the larger truth. Distance shifts responsibility inward. The farther you go, the more isolated your present becomes. That is an odd thing to discover at the first destination humans ever reach beyond Earth. For centuries, the moon functioned as a symbol of escape from the limits of ordinary life. It was the unreachable object we longed toward, the boundary marker of ambition. Reaching it seemed like a declaration that perhaps no horizon would stay closed forever. And in one sense, that declaration was justified. Walking on the moon was one of the great technical achievements in human history. It proved that our species could extend itself beyond the cradle of Earth and survive in a hostile environment through planning, machinery, and nerve. It deserved every bit of awe it received. But what it did not prove was that distance was becoming tame. In some ways, it proved the opposite. Because once humans actually went there, the moon stopped being merely an emblem and became a measured reality. And measured realities have a habit of shrinking fantasies down to size. The moon was not an ethereal lantern overhead. It was a place with travel times, communication delays, harsh temperatures, abrasive dust, limited margins, and no mercy for mistakes. It was near enough to reach, but not near enough to rescue romantic ideas about the openness of space. If anything, the moon taught the first serious lesson in extraterrestrial separation. You could go there, yes, but once there, Earth was not beside you. It was away. There is a visual side to this as well, and I think it matters more than we often admit. From Earth, the moon dominates the night sky in a way that tricks the emotions. It looks large, familiar, and present. It is one of the few celestial bodies whose shape and markings can be appreciated with the naked eye. That encourages a sense of nearness, even ownership. The moon seems part of our weather, part of our evenings, part of our local surroundings. But vision is a terrible judge of cosmic intimacy. Objects can appear emotionally close while remaining physically distant enough to force delay. The moon teaches that lesson gently, but it teaches it all the same. What looks companionable from a garden chair can still be far enough to place a measurable pause into every exchange, and the implications are wider than a single conversation. Once delay exists, even in miniature, the entire fantasy of centralized control begins to weaken. There is a popular image of future space activity in which everything remains neatly supervised from Earth, as if expanding into space simply means extending the radius of headquarters. The moon already resists that image. The people on site must be competent in their own right. The machines on site must tolerate greater independence. Plans must assume interruption. Communication must assume waiting. When the nearest world beyond Earth already demands these concessions, the rest of the universe is not going to be kinder. The moon also reveals something else that becomes increasingly important as distances rise. There is a difference between travel time and signal time, and both can rule your life in different ways. You may send a message quickly by the standards of space, yet still feel the separation because physical assistance takes much longer. On Earth, we are accustomed to information and intervention being tied fairly closely together. If you can call for help, help is probably on some plausible route toward you. In space, those two things drift apart. A message may cross the gap long before a person, a machine, or a supply shipment ever could. That means awareness does not guarantee remedy. Knowledge of a problem is not the same as the power to change it in time. Again, the moon softens this truth because it is the kindest version of the problem. Resupply is possible, return is possible, evacuation is at least imaginable. The system is not closed in any ultimate sense, yet the pattern has already begun. Delay enters communication first, then logistics, then control, then rescue, then culture, then identity. Step by step, the off-world place stops being an extension of home and becomes its own temporal island. And that phrase matters here. Temporal island. Not merely distant, but set apart by the timing of reality itself. The moon is often described as a stepping stone, and that is fair enough in engineering discussions. But in another sense, it is also a warning stone. It is the last place where the problem of light speed remains emotionally manageable. Beyond it, the delays stop feeling like a slight awkwardness in conversation and start becoming a new structure of life. The moon is where the universe first clears its throat and says, very quietly, you may want to reconsider what you mean by near. For that reason, lunar distance is one of the most important educational distances in the whole cosmos. It is small enough to grasp, real enough to matter, and unforgiving enough to correct the imagination. If light cannot make the moon immediate, then light is not going to make Mars immediate. It will not make the outer planets immediate. It will not make the nearest stars immediate. The logic does not change, only the delay grows, and as the delay grows, something subtle but profound happens to the meaning of presence. On Earth, to be somewhere and to be available are often nearly the same thing. In space, those ideas begin to separate. A person can be alive, speaking, working, and still already unreachable in the normal human sense. They may be visible through data, audible through delayed communication, traceable through telemetry, and yet absent from the sphere of instant mutual action. The moon gives us the smallest version of that estrangement. It is our first demonstration that presence in space is not the same as participation in a common now. That phrase common now may sound abstract, but the experience is not abstract at all. It is built from the simplest moments. A laugh that arrives after the joke has finished. A warning that cannot interrupt fast enough to feel like intervention. A pause before reassurance. A pause before instruction. A pause before hearing that someone is still there. Those tiny delays are bearable. They are not catastrophic, but they are signals of a deeper reality. Distance has entered the room. The shared present has become slightly misaligned. There is no villain in this. The moon is not cruel. Light is not malicious. Physics is not withholding comfort out of principle. These are simply the terms of the universe. Yet the emotional effect remains. Human beings are creatures of responsive environments. We calm each other with immediate voices, immediate gestures, immediate corrections. We build communities out of rapid feedback. Once feedback is delayed, even a little, something basic changes in how togetherness feels. The moon is the nearest proof. This also explains why the moon, despite being nearby in cosmic terms, still inspires a kind of existential seriousness. It is not just the vacuum or the desolation or the black sky at noon, it is the separation. The knowledge that Earth is right there, plainly visible and still not right there at all. You can look at home and remain unmistakably away from it. That is one of the strangest gifts space offers us. It turns visibility into a lesson in distance. The Earth can hang huge and beautiful above the horizon, and yet every message to it still takes time. Sight does not erase waiting. Beauty does not erase waiting. Familiarity does not erase waiting. And once you have learned that lesson with the moon, the rest of the cosmos begins to reorganize itself. The old intuition that nearby looking things must also be immediately accessible starts to weaken. You begin to understand that the universe is layered not just by location, but by delay. Earth and Moon are separated by a pause, Earth and Mars by longer pauses, the outer planets by longer still, the stars by spans that break ordinary conversation entirely. The same principle repeats, without mercy and without exception. Which means the moon is not merely a place we visited, it is the point where human beings first touched the larger fact that the universe is built from waiting times. That may seem like a severe interpretation of something as inspiring as lunar exploration, but I think it honours the achievement more than sentimental language does. To go to the moon was not to abolish distance, it was to confront distance directly and succeed anyway within narrow limits. It was to step into a world that proved both our reach and our confinement at the same time. We were capable of crossing the gap, but not of making the gap disappear. And that distinction is the one that matters for everything that follows. Because if the nearest world beyond Earth already imposes delay that humans must actively work around, then the next question stops being whether light is fast in some absolute bragging rights sense. The real question becomes how quickly even this first manageable delay swells into something far more severe once the destination is no longer hanging in our sky each night, but circling the same sun at a far greater remove, waiting out there as the next test of whether the universe can still be called close in any meaningful way. Once you leave the scale of the moon behind, the comforting part of the discussion ends very quickly. The moon at least lets you keep one foot in the familiar. It is close enough that the delay, while real, still fits inside human patience. You can notice it, adapt to it, and continue. It alters the rhythm of communication, but it does not destroy the possibility of a shared mission. That is why it makes such a useful first step. It introduces the idea gently. The stars do not. The moment the destination is no longer another world circling near Earth, but another sun entirely, distance stops feeling like a technical nuisance and starts behaving like a sentence. Not a sentence in the grammatical sense, but in the older and harsher sense. A condition imposed, a reality you enter and then must live under. At stellar scales, the speed of light is no longer just a source of inconvenience. It becomes the thing that breaks immediacy beyond repair. That change is not mainly emotional, it is structural. Between Earth and the Moon, a signal takes time, but the exchange still belongs to one continuous operation. Between Earth and a nearby star, even light takes years. That means the moment you stop speaking, the delay is no longer a pause in conversation. It is the conversion of conversation into archaeology. A message sent out is not part of a living back and forth in the way humans usually understand communication. It is a statement launched into time, with the earliest possible reply belonging to a future version of you, or perhaps not to you at all. At that point, the issue is not that communication has become difficult, it is that communication has changed category. This is where our language starts to betray us. We still use words like message, contact, visit, expedition, mission, neighbour. Those words belong to a world in which the participants remain inside one practical present. They suggest that if two places are linked, then the link can still function on human terms, but interstellar distance does not honour human terms. It stretches them until they break. A star can be the nearest one beyond the Sun and still remain so far away that a round-trip exchange of even the simplest information becomes a multi-year affair at minimum. Not a voyage, not a settlement, not a grand fleet, just information. That should already be enough to reset our instincts. We tend to imagine the stars as places waiting for travel in the same way distant continents once waited for ships. Difficult to reach, yes, but fundamentally part of the same world, soon to be connected by better maps and better vehicles. The comparison is flattering to our ambitions, but it is false. Oceans are not light years wide. Continents do not separate one present from another. A ship crossing an ocean may be gone a long time by human standards, but it still arrives inside a civilization that remembers why it was sent. Its departure and its arrival still belong to one thread of active history. Interstellar travel does not grant that so generously. The farther out you go, the more likely it becomes that departure and arrival belong to different ages, and that is only the beginning. Even if one imagines machines rather than humans making the journey, the same problem remains. A machine can tolerate long travel times better than a human body, but it cannot repeal the speed of light. It cannot stop the fact that every report home is old by the time it arrives. It cannot prevent the target system from being known only through delayed evidence. It cannot make command and response overlap in any ordinary way. A probe sent to another star would not be an extension of Earth in the way a rover on the Moon can be treated as an extension of a nearby control room. It would be much more like a distant branch of history unfolding on its own, with our knowledge of it arriving years after each event occurred. That difference matters because a lot of what we mean by presence depends on timing. To be present somewhere is not only to have matter located there, it is to be able to participate in what is happening while it is happening. Interstellar distance attacks that ability directly. A civilization may send objects, machines, or even living beings across the dark between stars, but the farther they travel, the less they remain part of the same responsive world as the place they left. Their situation becomes increasingly local. Their emergence is their own, their decisions are their own, their mistakes are their own, their discoveries are their own for years before anyone else even hears of them. Distance becomes a sentence, because it assigns each region its own clock of relevance. That phrase may sound severe, but there is no softer way to say it. What is urgent in one star system may be ancient news in another before anyone can react. What is politically important in one location may be forgotten in the other by the time the information arrives. What counts as a crisis, a victory, a warning, or a plea for help becomes radically local because causality arrives so late. Shared reality does not disappear altogether, but it becomes weak and delayed, more like correspondence between eras than cooperation between neighbours. This is where the common dream of interstellar civilization becomes much stranger than it first appears. People often picture a future network of human or alien settlements spread among the stars, trading knowledge, culture, perhaps goods, perhaps law, perhaps military alliances, perhaps a common identity. There is nothing wrong with imagining that. It is an old and natural form of hope. But once you keep the actual speed limit in the picture, the dream stops looking like a large country or a federation and starts looking more like a loose family of distant archives. The stars may host many centres of life, but unless some way around the light speed barrier exists, they do not easily host one continuous conversational civilization. Even the nearest stars are enough to make ordinary governance absurd. A policy dispute cannot be settled in real time. A military threat cannot be monitored in real time. Scientific collaboration loses the texture of collaboration and becomes an exchange of long-delayed reports. Cultural life diverges because every society is forced to become mostly self-responsive. The farther the network expands, the less it behaves like a network in the living sense, and the more it behaves like a set of separated worlds that occasionally receive each other's pasts. That is what it means for distance to become a sentence. It does not merely delay motion, it breaks simultaneity as a practical social resource, and once simultaneity is gone, many of our favourite fantasies about the stars stop working. There can still be journeys, there can still be colonisation, exploration, migration, perhaps even one-way expansion. But all of those things take place under a rule far stricter than most frontier stories admit. Every new star system is not just farther away in space, it is farther away in mutual responsiveness. It is not just difficult to reach, it is condemned to drift into its own sphere of relevant time. That makes interstellar separation different from every separation in earlier human history. There have always been remote places on Earth. There were valleys cut off by mountains, islands cut off by weather, regions isolated for months or years by poor roads and political collapse. But the isolation was never written into physics at the deepest level. Improvement was always possible. Faster ships, stronger engines, undersea cables, aircraft, satellites, fibre optics. The gap could be narrowed because the gap was small compared with the maximum speed available. Interstellar gaps are different. They are large compared with the maximum speed available. No better engine changes that basic relationship. You can get closer to light speed perhaps, but you cannot make light itself hurry. That is why light, despite being the fastest thing in the universe, begins to look almost cruel at stellar scales. Not because it is slow in some absolute sense, but because it is exactly fast enough to tempt you with possibility, while being too slow to preserve connection. The stars are not utterly beyond influence, they are just beyond timely influence, which may in practice amount to much the same thing for most of what living beings would care about. There is a special kind of frustration in that. If the stars were totally invisible, we might accept our confinement more easily. If they were physically inaccessible and also hidden, they would become mere abstractions. But the stars are visible, they flood the sky, they invite thought, they seem close enough to belong to one scene. Our minds are naturally drawn to them as destinations because sight creates a false intimacy. The trouble is that the visual presence of the stars and the practical remoteness of the stars are wildly out of proportion. The sky is full of apparent nearness attached to real delay. This mismatch has shaped human imagination for a very long time. Long before modern astronomy, people projected stories onto the stars because they were there, above, immediate to sight. Later, once science revealed what they actually were, the emotional habit did not vanish. The stars remained available to fantasy because they remained visible. Even now, when we know perfectly well how far away they are, our intuition still cheats. We hear that a star is nearby and some stubborn local part of the brain interprets nearby in the old terrestrial sense. Nearby should mean reachable. Nearby should mean relevant. Nearby should mean that if something happens there, it still belongs to the same broad moment as us. Physics answers with silence and delay. There is another consequence here that matters more than it first appears. Interstellar distance does not only isolate societies from each other, it isolates generations within the same project. Imagine a mission that takes decades or longer even under favourable assumptions. The people who launch it are not the people who receive its outcome. The political conditions that justified it may be gone by the time it matters. The language spoken at departure may have shifted by the time meaningful results return. Institutions that planned it may no longer exist. Even memory itself can become the weak point. A species may have the technical ability to begin a project whose completion lies beyond the coherent lifetime of the culture that started it. That changes what ambition means. On Earth, most large projects can still be imagined as belonging to one broad social present. Even if they take years, their initiators expect some continuity between intention and result. Interstellar action undermines that continuity. The very scale of the undertaking begins to separate motives from outcomes. One generation launches, another maintains, another interprets, another perhaps forgets why it began. By the time the stars are involved, time itself becomes an additional distance layered over the physical one. This is why the idea of interstellar travel often carries such a strange mix of inspiration and melancholy. It is not merely hard. It threatens to unmake the ordinary human reward structure that makes projects feel connected to life. To go between stars is not just to travel far. It is to surrender the hope that movement and meaning will stay tightly linked. The journey may still be worthwhile. It may still be one of the greatest things a civilization could attempt. But it does not take place in the emotional framework of a voyage. It takes place in the framework of inheritance. And inheritance is a much colder thing than adventure. None of this means the stars are irrelevant. Quite the opposite. They are central to understanding what sort of universe we live in. They force us to confront scale honestly. They expose the limit of the local instincts we carry around from Earth. They show that the prison of light is not some distant cosmological detail, but something that begins almost immediately once the target is a true stellar destination. The first gap between stars is already enough to break the dream of simple, active, continuous interstellar life. That is worth sitting with, because human culture often defaults to a narrative of inevitable outward integration. First villages, then cities, then nations, then planets, then star systems, then galaxies. The pattern feels satisfying because it mirrors earlier expansions. Small circles join into larger circles. The map fills in. But at stellar distance, the pattern runs into a very hard wall. Expansion may still happen, but integration becomes questionable. A species could in principle spread without remaining one thing in any practical sense. It could seed many systems and still never overcome the fact that each system is locked into its own present by the speed limit. If that sounds less like empire and more like fragmentation, that is because it is. Even a successful wave of settlement among the stars would not automatically produce one common civilization. More likely it would produce cousins separated by history. Shared origins, perhaps. Shared myths, perhaps. Shared biology, perhaps. But day to day, mutual influence would thin out quickly. The delay would not merely slow political unity, it would erode the conditions that make unity meaningful. Law depends on timely enforcement. Markets depend on timely information. Culture depends on timely exchange. Collective identity depends on enough shared present to feel collective. Strip away timeliness and what remains is memory plus delay. This is why I keep returning to the word sentence. Not because stellar distance is dramatic in some theatrical way, but because it imposes a condition you cannot argue with. Once you are between stars, the structure of possibility narrows. Rescue becomes doubtful. Conversation becomes archival. Governance becomes local. Response becomes late. The future stops feeling like a road and starts feeling like a series of isolated chambers connected by beams of old light. And yet, strangely, the stars are still the generous version of the problem. At least stars can in principle be reached by something slower than light, if one is prepared to wait long enough and pay an extraordinary price. At least there remains some notion of crossing, However grimly difficult, at least the prison still has adjacent cells. That is more than can be said once the scale grows again, and the galaxy itself stops looking like a community of destinations and begins to look like a structure so large that even its local neighbourhoods are mostly time-separated from one another. The stars already teach us that distance can become a sentence. The galaxy teaches us that sentences can be nested inside larger ones. It is one thing to accept that the nearest stars are far apart. That alone is enough to damage a lot of old fantasies, but there is still a comforting instinct that tries to survive the first blow. It says perhaps the distances between individual stars are large, yes, but surely a galaxy is still a kind of larger hometown. Surely once a civilization becomes advanced enough, the stars of its own galaxy could still form one broad community. Difficult to manage, perhaps. Slow by human standards, perhaps. Yet still, in some meaningful sense, a neighbourhood. That instinct does not survive close inspection. The word neighbourhood carries far more than a simple idea of physical closeness. It carries an idea of mutual relevance. Neighbours affect one another within the same living frame of time. Their lives overlap. Their choices can matter to one another while those choices are still fresh. If something changes in one house, the others can know about it before the reason for caring has disappeared. Even when neighbours do not speak much, they share weather, roads, noise, risk, convenience, infrastructure, and the small overlapping present that makes them part of one functioning environment. A galaxy does not work like that. We call it our galaxy, and that phrase encourages a certain emotional misunderstanding. It sounds almost local, almost inclusive. The Milky Way becomes a single name structure, and because it has one name, the mind quietly treats it as one place. But a single name is not the same thing as a shared present. A galaxy is not one place in the ordinary sense. It is a colossal arrangement of stars, gas, dust, dark matter, radiation, ancient remnants, and slow, gravitational choreography spread across distances so large that even light struggles to move from one side to another in any useful way. The fact that it forms one gravitationally bound structure does not make it socially, causally, or historically unified on scales that matter to living beings. That is the crucial distinction. Structure is not neighbourhood. From far away, a galaxy looks coherent. It has shape. It has motion. It has a centre, spiral arms, clusters, patterns, and history. Astronomers can study it as a whole. Equations can describe it as a whole. Simulations can model it as a whole. Yet for anything inside it, especially anything mortal, time-limited and dependent on communication, the whole is mostly theoretical. The galaxy exists as a totality in science, but not as a practical common world. This becomes obvious the moment you convert the size of the galaxy into weighting. A signal crossing a room feels immediate. A signal crossing a city still feels immediate to modern life. Even across continents, technology often hides delay well enough that we remain emotionally careless about geography. But in a galaxy, delay swells past anything that could still be folded into normal expectation. Once communication between distant regions of the same galaxy takes spans longer than civilizations may endure in recognizable form, the word neighbourhood becomes absurd. The stars may share one broad gravitational home, but they do not share one living tempo. It helps to be very clear about what this means, because the imagination is stubborn. When people hear that a galaxy contains hundreds of billions of stars, the first reaction is often abundance. So many stars, so many chances, so many destinations, and in one sense that is fair. A galaxy is rich in material, rich in complexity, rich in possible worlds, but abundance is not the same thing as accessibility. A library can contain millions of books while keeping most of them locked away. A city can contain millions of people while leaving them strangers to one another. In the same way, a galaxy can contain extraordinary numbers of stars and still function less like a neighbourhood and more like an enormous archipelago of isolated historical zones. That last part matters. Historical zones. Not just locations, but zones separated by delayed information and delayed influence. If something occurs far away in the galaxy, you do not learn of it in a time frame that lets it belong to your ordinary world. You learn of it as one might learn of a distant kingdom from old chronicles carried across a desert. The event reaches you when it has already hardened into the past. You may study it, admire it, fear it, interpret it, but you do not inhabit the same responsive present as it does. This is true even if the galaxy were crowded with intelligence. That possibility is worth considering because it reveals how misleading the old language of cosmic loneliness can be. Suppose the galaxy contains many inhabited worlds. Suppose intelligent beings have arisen again and again under different suns. Suppose some of them are older than us, some younger, some stranger, some perhaps more familiar than we would expect. At first, this seems like the opposite of loneliness. A populated galaxy sounds almost social. Yet if communication across meaningful fractions of the galaxy takes so long that conversation becomes historical record rather than living exchange, then the crowding does not rescue the sense of isolation. It may deepen it. The galaxy would not be empty. It would be partitioned. That is the part science fiction often softens, because stories generally prefer societies that can react to one another within the duration of a scene. Fleets need orders, empires need administration, trade needs timely demand, diplomacy needs answers before the generation that asked the question is gone. Even rebellion is difficult to narrate when the capital and the colony are separated by the sort of delay that turns every command into an artifact. So fiction introduces shortcuts, faster travel, faster signalling, wormholes, gates, strange physics that politely arrives whenever the plot requires a shared present. Without those conveniences, the galaxy stops behaving like a stage set for human-style drama. It starts behaving like an archive of separated civilizations that may know of each other mostly through old light. That is far less convenient, but much closer to what physics seems willing to allow. And once you accept that, the galaxy changes character. It stops being a landscape of destinations and starts being a system of delays. One region is not just far away in distance, but far away in relevance. Another arm of the galaxy is not merely on the map. It is separated by weight so severe that even the idea of coordinated life across those distances begins to dissolve. The mind resists this because maps encourage a false feeling of unity. A map presents the whole at once. You can glance across it in seconds. Your eye can leap from one end to the other. But your eye is not a signal. Your attention is not a spacecraft. Cartography can compress space for the mind in ways the universe absolutely refuses to compress in reality. There is something almost unfair about that. We can picture the galaxy in a single image, yet no physical process available to us can stitch it into one shared arena on the same terms. The image seduces us into forgetting the weights hidden inside it. That is one reason galactic thinking often becomes sloppy. The whole can be conceived so easily that we mistake conceptual possession for practical access. But the weights are everything. A civilization on one side of the galaxy and another on the far side do not meaningfully coexist in the way two neighbouring societies on Earth coexist. They occupy the same larger structure, yes. They may even someday infer each other's presence, send long messages, or leave traces in the sky. But the possibility of mutual responsiveness is so weak and so delayed that calling them neighbours empties the word of its content. They are co-inhabitants of a gravitationally connected system, while living in what are, for all practical cultural purposes, separate ages. That phrase separate ages may seem severe, yet it is not exaggerated. Time matters because societies are not static. Languages shift, institutions collapse, sciences grow, split, and are forgotten. Religions rise, divide, and disappear. Moral assumptions drift. Bodies may even change if biology or technology alter the form of life itself. Over the spans required for light to bridge large galactic distances, The sender and receiver are unlikely to remain the same sort of beings in the same sort of circumstances. Even if contact were attempted, the contact would not link stable communities so much as different historical layers of communities. The galaxy would not be a network in the ordinary sense. It would be correspondence among transformations. This also means that the phrase galactic civilization should be handled with suspicion. It sounds grand, and it is grand, but what would it actually mean under real physical constraints? A common legal order across the galaxy would be absurd if laws could not be updated or enforced within relevant time. A common market would fail under delays that turn prices into fossils. A common political identity would thin into mythology if most members could never react to one another in the same living present. Perhaps some looser form of shared heritage could survive. A tradition, a memory, an origin story, a commitment preserved through long chains of delayed exchange. But that is much closer to a diaspora of deep time than to a neighbourhood. Even movement within a galaxy becomes stranger the more honestly you think about it. We like to imagine exploration as a heroic widening of the circle. First the homeworld, then nearby planets, then neighbouring stars, then clusters, then arms, then the entire galaxy. But widening is not the same as integrating. A species might indeed spread in stages, leaving settlements or descendants across many systems. Yet each step outward increases not only distance but temporal separation. The farther the wave travels, the more each branch becomes self-contained. News from the origin arrives old. Decisions made at the origin arrive older still. Corrections, help, criticism, inspiration, all are delayed until they become part of local history rather than external management. Expansion under these conditions is not the growth of one neighbourhood, it is the growth of estranged lineages. That is a colder picture than the old imperial maps of the stars, but it may be a more honest one. And honesty matters here because human beings are easily misled by scale when the numbers are too large for intuition. The galaxy is so vast that it slips out of feeling and becomes concept. Once that happens, metaphor takes over, and metaphor tends to borrow from familiar life. We say home galaxy, stellar neighbourhood, galactic community. These phrases are not useless, but they can be dangerous if they smuggle in assumptions about shared present and easy relevance. Familiar words do not magically domesticate unfamiliar scales. Often they do the opposite. They hide the violence of those scales behind pleasant language. There is also a practical side to this that affects even the search for life. People often ask whether we might one day detect signals from another civilization in our galaxy, and perhaps we might. But even success there would not necessarily mean meeting a peer in the ordinary sense. The signal might be ancient before it reaches us. Its sender might no longer exist, or might have changed beyond recognition. Our reply, if we sent one, would take equally long to arrive. The exchange would not resemble conversation so much as archaeological correspondence. We would be reading each other's history with immense pauses between pages. That does not make the effort meaningless. Quite the opposite. It would still be one of the most profound events in human history. To know that another intelligence existed somewhere in our galaxy would alter philosophy, religion, politics, and our idea of ourselves. Yet even that revelation would come wrapped in delay. It would be a discovery of coexistence without co-presence, company without togetherness. That may be the central lesson of the galaxy. Not emptiness, but separation. Not silence in the simple sense, but the kind of silence produced when every meaningful reply is stretched across spans so large that ordinary life cannot hold the whole exchange together. And the more one thinks about this, the more the galaxy starts to resemble less a neighbourhood, and more a museum whose rooms cannot hear one another. Many chambers, many possible histories, many lights still glowing. But each one mostly sealed into its own local time, observed from afar through delayed signals. You may walk the corridors of thought and imagine what lies inside each room, but opening the door is another matter. There is a temptation, at this point, to retreat into a smaller hope. Very well. Perhaps the whole galaxy is too large to function as one common world, but surely our own region of it could still count as a true local neighbourhood. Surely there must be some manageable radius within which the old human language remains fair. Perhaps a cluster of nearby stars. Perhaps a small network of systems that can still exchange messages and travellers without history slipping too badly between them. That is a more reasonable hope, and perhaps it is not entirely foolish. Yet even there, the pattern remains unforgiving. Near on galactic maps is still often remote on the scale of human projects. The prison does not vanish in the local district. It merely becomes less theatrical. So the galaxy teaches a difficult kind of humility. It tells us that belonging to a larger structure does not guarantee practical togetherness. It tells us that names can deceive. It tells us that a common gravitational home is not a common civic life. Most of all, it tells us that the universe is under no obligation to scale upward in the same social way that human history once did on Earth. Continents could become one world, because the maximum speed of communication and travel vastly exceeded the size of the planet in relevant ways. A galaxy does not permit the same trick so easily. Its size sits too close to the hard ceiling set by light. That changes everything. And it changes how we should think about the future. The grand destiny of spreading across the galaxy may still remain a dream of persistence, survival, and local flourishing, but it should not be imagined too casually as the formation of one unified neighbourhood. More likely it would be the planting of many distant presents, each one carrying memory of the others while living under the rule that causality arrives late. A galaxy of cousins, perhaps. A galaxy of descendants. A galaxy of ruins and awakenings and patient machines and civilizations that know of one another as historians know of ancient courts. But not, in any ordinary sense, a neighbourhood. And if even a galaxy refuses to behave like one shared local world, then the next step outward becomes harsher still, because beyond our own galaxy lies a destination that people love to imagine as our nearest great companion, our most obvious partner in the wider dark, a giant spiral approaching through space with all the cinematic promise of eventual encounter, while the reality is far less friendly and far more revealing of just how little the universe cares about our appetite for closeness. There is a popular image people carry around of the future in which our galaxy and Andromeda are locked in some grand cosmic approach, like two great cities sailing toward each other through the dark, destined at last to meet. It is one of those astronomical facts that sounds dramatic even before anyone explains it. Another galaxy is coming. Not just any galaxy, but the nearest large spiral galaxy to our own. Huge, visible in the sky with the right conditions, and moving toward us over immense spans of time. The story almost writes itself. Two island universes once thought separate and unreachable, gradually closing the gap. The obvious implication seems to be connection. Eventually, surely there will be contact. Eventually the distance will be overcome. Eventually the galaxies will stop being separate worlds and become one. That is the feeling the fact produces. It is not quite the reality. Andromeda is coming, yes, but we will never meet it in the way the mind first imagines. We will never stand at some cosmic border crossing and greet the newcomers. We will never watch two civilizations on opposite rims of two galaxies shake hands because the local group finally became friendly. We will never experience the approach the way neighbouring countries experience a new road being built between them. Even the most dramatic large-scale encounter available in our part of the universe refuses to become a human-style meeting. Distance, time, and the speed of light see to that. This is one of the best examples of how scale quietly ruins the emotional stories we try to tell about space. Andromeda feels like an approaching destination. It sounds like the universe is delivering a neighbouring galaxy into our reach. But that interpretation sneaks in all the wrong assumptions. It assumes that coming closer means becoming mutually present. It assumes that large structures can meet in the same way people or nations meet. It assumes that proximity eventually overcomes delay. Yet what astronomy really gives us here is not a story of meeting. It gives us a story of massive structures rearranging themselves over spans so long that almost everything human about the word meeting evaporates. To see why, it helps to start with the scale of what is actually being discussed. Andromeda is not around the corner in any meaningful sense. It is not the next district over. It is not a nearby object that we merely happen to be taking a very long time to reach. It is a full galaxy away. That phrase is so large that the mind tends to stop feeling it after a second or two. A full galaxy away. Hundreds of billions of stars organised into their own enormous system, with their own histories, their own dead stars, their own planets, their own clouds of gas, their own central black hole, their own internal distances so vast that even they are not a neighbourhood to themselves in any useful human sense. And that entire structure is still far enough from us that light requires a staggering stretch of time to cross between the two. So before Andromeda is anything else, it is delayed. It enters our awareness as old light. We do not see it now. We see it as it was long before any human civilization existed in anything like its current form. We see a report that left before our present world was imaginable. That alone should cool the language of meeting. You cannot meet something in real time when your first and most basic awareness of it already arrives from a vanished age. And yet the human mind resists that conclusion because motion is involved. Andromeda is not merely there, it is approaching. That makes it sound active and relational. Approaching suggests reduction of separation. Reduction of separation suggests future contact. But motion through space does not automatically create mutual presence when the distances are this large and the timescales are this indifferent to ordinary life. Things can move toward one another and still remain locked in separate presence all the way through the process. That is exactly what happens here. By the time Andromeda and the Milky Way truly begin to merge in any dramatic sense, every normal timescale of human history has long since dissolved into irrelevance. Entire biological lineages may have vanished. Continents will not look the same. The sun itself will be older. Whatever descendants of ours exist, if any do, may be so changed that calling them us would already feel more like courtesy than precision. The galaxies may be coming together, but the beings who care about the fact at the beginning are not the beings who would witness any later stage. The interval is too vast. A meeting that takes place only after the participants have ceased to be themselves is not a meeting in the ordinary sense. It is succession. This is the first reason we will never meet Andromeda. The event belongs to cosmic time, not civilizational time. It unfolds so slowly that what looks from afar like a coming encounter is, for anything human, a procession of remote stages separated by spans that erase continuity of memory. But even if we set that aside and imagine some fantastically durable line of descendants, or machines or archives carrying our perspective forward, the deeper problem remains. Galaxies do not meet the way maps and metaphors encourage us to think they do. When two countries meet, roads connect, people cross, trade begins. Cultures influence one another through direct contact. When two crowds meet, bodies share one physical space at the same time. When two fleets meet, the ships become part of one active situation. The word meeting implies a convergence of actors into one responsive moment. Galaxies do not provide that. A galaxy is mostly space, enormous, absurd, almost offensive amounts of space. The stars inside it are separated by distances that are already enough to break the ordinary meaning of neighbour. So when two galaxies merge, it is not like two dense swarms colliding in a shower of constant close encounters. It is more like two vast, sparse structures passing through and around each other, while gravity slowly reshapes the whole arrangement. There can be disturbances, tidal stretching, new bursts of star formation in some regions, altered orbits, large-scale structural change. But star does not meet star in the intimate way the language suggests. Most of the time, the emptiness does what emptiness does. It leaves everything scandalously far apart. That is the second reason Andromeda will never become the sort of meeting our intuition wants. Even in merger, closeness at the scale of galaxies does not translate into closeness at the scale of inhabited worlds. The structures can overlap, while the actual islands of matter we care about remain separated by enormous distances. It is a little like announcing that two deserts are about to merge, and expecting that therefore two villages somewhere within them will soon share a street. The statement sounds plausible only until you remember how much of a desert is not village. A galaxy is mostly not star, mostly not planet, mostly not life. It is a tremendous spatial framework within which the few, solid places remain tiny and scattered. So even the grand event of galactic collision does not magically produce a convenient social geography. It rearranges the large-scale map, yes, it does not create a neighbourhood picnic. There is another subtle problem here, and it concerns information rather than travel. People sometimes imagine that as Andromeda comes closer, communication with whatever might exist there becomes gradually more plausible, as though approach itself eventually turns distance from impossible into difficult, and from difficult into manageable. But the approach does not happen on terms that matter to living exchange. The reduction in distance is real, yet it is swallowed by timescales so huge that any conceivable conversation remains trapped in absurd delay. Even if there were intelligent beings in Andromeda, and even if both sides somehow detected one another, the structure of contact would still look less like diplomacy and more like the slow exchange of messages between different epochs. Ask a question, and the question travels for longer than civilizations typically remain recognizable. Receive a reply, and the reply belongs to descendants, not to you. Send a warning, and the warning reaches people who may have transformed their entire society or vanished by the time it arrives. Receive a map, and the map describes a system that may no longer be as it was. Everything important about human-style contact depends on the ability of cause and response to remain inside one practical frame. Andromeda does not offer that frame. It never does. Not now, not soon, not while the galaxies are still distinct, and not even in the dramatic age of merger if what you are imagining is a coherent mutual present between actual inhabited worlds. This is why the phrase approaching galaxy can be emotionally misleading. It sounds as though the universe is delivering us an exception to the rule of separation. At last, something truly large is coming close enough to matter. At last, the prison bars may be widening. At last, there may be a grand reunion of cosmic provinces. But the prison is not broken by large structures moving around inside it. The prison is the limit on timely interaction itself, and that limit remains in force throughout the entire story. The most one can honestly say is that Andromeda and the Milky Way belong to the same larger gravitational fate. They are part of one slow future. But a shared fate is not the same as a meeting. Many things share futures without ever sharing moments. Two mountain ranges can erode into the same sea basin over geological time without ever entering one common event from the point of view of any observer standing on either slope. In the same way, two galaxies can drift toward eventual merger, while every meaningful experience of their relation remains fractured by delay. There is something almost cruelly instructive about this. If even Andromeda, our nearest great galactic companion, does not become available to us in the rich human sense of availability, then the universe has made its point very clearly. It has given us the friendliest large-scale case and still refused to let it turn into intimacy. Andromeda is, in a sense, the best-case scenario for a neighbouring galaxy. It is relatively close by extragalactic standards. It is part of our local group. It is not racing away with the deep expansion-dominated flow of the far universe in the same way truly remote galaxies are. Gravity matters here. There is an actual long-term interaction on the large scale. If there were ever going to be a galaxy that became part of our long future in a concrete way, this would be the one. And still, the translation from cosmic interaction to lived encounter never happens cleanly. The times are too long, the internal distances are too large, the speed limit is too strict. That should make us very cautious about the old frontier language. If even our most important neighbouring galaxy does not become something we can genuinely meet, then much of the broader extragalactic universe is not a frontier at all. It is scenery, valuable scenery, scientifically rich scenery, moving scenery, ancient scenery, but scenery nonetheless from the perspective of practical shared existence. There is also a comforting misunderstanding people sometimes fall into when they hear about the future merger. They imagine it as an eventual solution to loneliness. Very well, perhaps galaxies are isolated now, but in the deep future ours and Andromeda will become one, and then at least the separation between them will be gone. Yet the merger does not abolish the underlying rule. The new larger galaxy that eventually results will still be a huge sparse stellar system governed by the same speed of light. It will still not be a neighbourhood in the ordinary sense. The prison does not disappear because two cells have had their walls reconfigured into a larger block. That image may be less glamorous than the usual artistic renderings of two glowing spirals tangling together in magnificent arcs, but it is the better guide to reality. Yes, the structure will change. Yes, stars will follow new paths. Yes, the sky from whatever worlds survive in whatever forms will look different. But no, this does not produce the kind of togetherness people instinctively project onto the event. It produces a new arrangement of separation, a larger geography of delay. This is one reason astronomy can feel both humbling and slightly mischievous. It presents us with facts that sound emotionally obvious, and then quietly reveals that the obvious emotional reading is wrong. Another galaxy is coming. Surely that means closeness. In fact, it means a very slow change in a large-scale structure that preserves most of what makes true contact difficult. The drama is real, the intimacy is not, and there is a further lesson inside that. Human beings are extremely vulnerable to stories in which motion is mistaken for access. We see an object coming nearer and assume relationship is deepening. That is often true on Earth. A ship approaching shore does mean a coming encounter. A person walking toward you does mean a coming interaction. A weather front moving in does mean local consequences soon enough. But cosmic motion takes place under very different terms. Things can move toward one another for billions of years and still never enter the kind of shared now that makes meeting possible for conscious creatures living finite lives. The word toward loses much of its human warmth once the timeline becomes that extreme. This also helps explain why the future of Andromeda and the Milky Way belongs more naturally in cosmology than in adventure. It is a story about what gravity does to large structures over immense time, not a story about routes opening between communities. It tells us something profound about the dynamics of galaxies, but almost nothing hopeful about the possibility of overcoming separation on the scale that matters to living minds. The stars remain far apart. The inhabited places, if there are any, remain buried within those far apart stars. Communication remains slow. Reaction remains late. No parade of arrivals occurs. No great intergalactic town square appears. At most, one could imagine a very patient and very advanced civilization using the deep future rearrangement as part of some unimaginably long project. But even then, the key word would be patient, and patient on a scale that no ordinary use of the word can bear. We would not be talking about meeting. We would be talking about stewardship across epochs, across species changes, perhaps across the fading of stars themselves. The vocabulary of neighbours and arrivals would have become so inadequate by then that it would sound almost childish. So Andromeda serves as a correction. It corrects the assumption that approaching large things become personally relevant. It corrects the assumption that shared structure implies shared present. It corrects the assumption that enough cosmic time eventually turns every far object into a member of the same practical world. Often, it does not. Often, it merely rearranges the scenery while the rule of delayed causality remains untouched. And this matters because Andromeda is still part of the unusually privileged little region of the universe that gravity is kept from slipping entirely away from us. That point is easy to miss, because Andromeda already feels so remote that calling it privileged sounds ridiculous. But compared with most galaxies, it is privileged. Compared with the wider universe, it is part of the tiny exception. It is one of the very few great structures that belong to our long-term gravitational company at all. If even that exception does not rescue us from the logic of separation, the general case is much harsher. Most of the universe does not approach us. Most of it recedes. Most of it is not destined for some future merger inside a local group. Most of it is already being drawn beyond meaningful exchange by the expansion of space itself. In other words, Andromeda is not the beginning of a more connected cosmos. It is the nearest example of how disconnected even the lucky part already is. And beyond that lucky part, the situation stops looking merely delayed and starts looking terminal. If Andromeda already feels remote enough to defeat the ordinary meaning of meeting, then the next realization is worse. Andromeda is one of the exceptions. It belongs to the small part of the cosmos that remains tied to us by gravity, strongly enough that the expansion of the universe does not simply carry it away into permanent irrelevance. That is what makes the wider picture so unsettling. The galaxy we like to imagine as distant company is already part of the lucky minority. Most of the universe is not in that category. Most of it is not approaching. Most of it is not waiting. Most of it has already begun slipping beyond any future in which contact, travel, or even exchange of fresh information could still mean what we normally think they mean. This is where the story stops sounding like a complaint about very large distances and starts sounding like a statement about loss. For a while, it is easy to comfort yourself with the idea that the universe is simply vast. Vastness is intimidating, but it still sounds open. A desert is vast. An ocean is vast. A forest can be vast. In each case, the word leaves room for crossing. It leaves room for endurance, navigation, patience, and eventually arrival. That is the old frontier feeling, just scaled upward. Space is large, yes, but perhaps enough time and enough ingenuity can still turn far things into future destinations. The expanding universe ruins that comfort because it adds a second layer to the problem. The distances are not merely large. The large-scale structure of space is changing, and it is changing in a way that does not preserve every possible future connection. Astronomers have strong evidence that the universe is expanding, and that this expansion is accelerating rather than slowing down. Space on the larger scales is not patiently holding still, while civilizations think about what to do next. It is carrying distant galaxies farther apart, and the farther away they are, the more severe that separation becomes. This is the point where the word slipped becomes more accurate than the word distant. A distant object can still belong to your future. A slipping object is one whose relation to you is changing in the wrong direction. It is not simply waiting at the end of a hard journey. It is being removed from the category of things that can ever become part of your shared world. That distinction matters enormously. It turns cosmic remoteness into cosmic forfeiture. The strangest part is that we can still see much of what we are losing. In fact, that is part of the cruelty of the arrangement. The sky remains full of galaxies. Telescopes can reveal countless more. Long exposure images show a richness that almost mocks the idea of confinement. The universe appears crowded, textured, generous. Yet appearance is doing something deceptive there. To see a galaxy is not to possess a future with it. Often it means only that light which began its journey long ago has not finished arriving yet. We are surrounded not by immediate company but by delayed reports. The visible universe and the reachable universe are not the same thing, not even close. That difference is one of the most important things cosmology teaches, and one of the least intuitive. There are regions whose light can still reach us because it was emitted long ago, while signals sent from those same regions now may never arrive, no matter how long we wait. Modern cosmology describes a cosmic event horizon. a boundary separating places whose future light can still reach us from places whose future light never will. In other words, part of the universe is visible to us only as a vanishing record. We can receive old messages from some regions that no new message from them will ever replace. That is not merely distance, that is disconnection in progress. It helps to say it in a more human way. Imagine standing in a city where letters from certain neighbourhoods still arrive because they were sent long ago, but any letter posted there today is doomed never to reach you. You can read the past of those places. You cannot share a future with them. They have not vanished from sight, yet they have slipped out of reciprocity. Something like that is happening on cosmic scales. The universe lets us watch some of its more distant regions the way one might watch a shoreline sinking into fog while still hearing echoes from an earlier moment. Once that idea settles in, the night sky changes character again. It is no longer just a record of delay. It is also a record of narrowing possibility. This is what makes the accelerating universe feel harsher than mere vastness. In a static or gently evolving cosmos, one might at least imagine that every place remained in principle part of one eventual map of possible relations, even if the routes were absurdly difficult. But in an accelerating universe, some routes do not merely remain hard. They are erased as meaningful futures. The map is not simply large. It is actively stratifying into what can still matter to us, and what can only be observed as it fades into untouchable history. There is a temptation here to reply that this is all too grand to care about. After all, humanity is not planning a trip to a remote galaxy next week. Our lives are local. Our technology remains very young. Why worry that most of the universe is slipping away when we were never going to reach most of it anyway? There is some practical sense in that objection, but it misses the deeper point. The issue is not that we personally had bookings and now need to cancel them. The issue is that the universe is not structured as an open arena waiting for maturity. The closure is built in. The confinement is not due to our current weakness. It is part of the architecture. That matters philosophically because it tells us what sort of cosmos we inhabit. We do not live in an immature civilization standing at the threshold of universal connection. We live in a late enough universe that large portions of it are already beyond any future exchange that could still be called mutual. The frontier image suggests unread territory. The event horizon suggests foreclosed territory, and foreclosed is the right mood for this part of the story. Even in the present, our own galaxy and its small local companions make up the nearest and most privileged domain of possible long-term interaction. That is where gravity still resists the general trends strongly enough to keep some large-scale structure together. Beyond that, the expansion dominates more and more decisively. Distant galaxies recede with the growth of space itself, and the accelerating expansion means that many of them are not merely hard to visit. They're already outside any future in which timely exchange could be recovered. NASA has described this in blunt terms, noting that the portion of space visible from Earth will steadily shrink in the very long run, as galaxies now within view are accelerated beyond a cosmic event horizon. That phrase, steadily shrink, is quietly devastating. It means the great panoramic richness of the cosmos is not a permanent entitlement. What we can observe now is partly a gift of living when ancient light from far regions is still arriving. Future observers, if they exist in the unimaginably distant eras ahead, may inhabit a sky that reveals far less of the universe's large-scale history. Much of the evidence now available to astronomy will not remain available forever. Entire populations of galaxies may fade from practical view, not because they cease to exist, but because the structure of space removes them from exchange and eventually from observation in any useful sense. So most of the universe has already slipped away in two related meanings. First, much of it is beyond any realistic future of travel or shared causality. Second, some of it is already in the process of becoming less and less visible as a living part of cosmic context. The first loss is one of access. The second is one of witness. There is something particularly lonely about the second kind of loss. It is one thing to be told that distant places are unreachable. It is another to realise that the evidence they were ever there in the richly connected way we now infer may not remain obvious forever. Cosmology is being practiced during a window in which the universe still discloses a great deal of its history to us. That should make us feel fortunate, but it should also make us careful. The largeness we see is not simply a permanent theatre set awaiting future empires. It is a temporary visibility layered over permanent separation. This is why the prison metaphor becomes stronger rather than weaker when you look outward. A prison is not defined only by walls you can see up close. It is also defined by the fact that many routes simply do not lead anywhere useful, no matter how sincerely you wish they did. In cosmology, the wall is not a physical barrier made of matter. It is the combination of finite light speed, immense distance, and accelerating expansion. Together they sort the universe into regions of possible relation and regions of one-way spectacle. We can learn from the spectacle, we cannot join it. And that last sentence is the one that most directly challenges the frontier instinct. Frontiers are for joining. They promise eventual incorporation into the same broad world. They invite the thought that what is distant now will later be local. The accelerating universe cancels that promise for most of the cosmos. What is distant now does not patiently await promotion into our circle of practical life. Much of it is leaving the circle entirely. That does not mean all is lost, and it is important not to slide into melodrama. There remains an enormous amount within the local cosmic environment that could matter. Our own solar system alone contains more than enough complexity, danger, beauty, and possibility to occupy civilizations for inconceivable spans. Nearby stars remain genuine objects of interest, however forbidding. The Milky Way remains a vast setting for science, and perhaps one day for forms of exploration we can barely sketch. Even the local group of galaxies contains a kind of long-term gravitational family relation, however cold and delayed. There is plenty left to wonder about. But wonder should not be confused with openness. The fact that much remains near enough to matter does not rescue the larger truth. Most of the universe is not our future partner. Most of it is not waiting for a handshake from a sufficiently advanced species. It is already on the other side of a divide that no engineering can repeal. There is also a subtle but important emotional shift here. When people first learn that the universe is expanding, they often imagine it as a neutral fact of geometry, a kind of grand rising bread of space in which everything simply gets farther apart. That image is useful to a point, but it can sound too innocent. Expansion is not emotionally neutral once you understand what it does to causality. It is not merely making the map bigger. It is changing which parts of the map can still belong to each other in the future. It is redrawing the terms of cosmic relationship. In that sense, acceleration is not just motion. It is estrangement becoming permanent. That permanence is what makes this section of the story so hard to absorb. Human beings are very good at imagining delays that eventually resolve. Trains arrive late, storms pass, roads open, ships come in, messages catch up. Even grief often carries the hidden assumption that distance and time can still be bridged somehow by memory, effort, or return. The expanding universe introduces a colder category. Some separations do not wait to be bridged. They harden with time. The longer the universe evolves under accelerated expansion, the more decisively some distant structures fall out of the category of ever again. That is why astronomy can sometimes sound like a study of abundance, while secretly being a study of missed chances. Not missed because anyone failed morally or technically, but missed because the window of possible mutuality on cosmic scales is limited by the design of space-time itself. We arrived in a universe already old, already expanding, already moving toward greater large-scale isolation. We did not wake at the beginning of the story. We woke during a chapter in which the doors to many other chapters were already closing. Seen that way, even our current observations take on a slightly elegiac quality. Every deep field image is not only a census of galaxies, it is a record of what once stood inside a broader visible relation to us. Some of those galaxies are not future destinations in any meaningful sense. They are historical revelations, light delivered from places whose ongoing existence can no longer become part of our shared causal life. We study them brilliantly. We do not join them. And perhaps the most unsettling part is that the universe does not announce this loss with any obvious drama. There is no cosmic alarm, no visible gate swinging shut across the night sky. The stars still shine, the galaxies still glow, the data still arrives. Everything looks open to the eye. It is the physics underneath that turns the scene from abundance into separation. The prison bars are not bright. They are conceptual. They are woven into how light travels through an expanding cosmos. That may be why the idea takes so long to feel real. It asks the mind to accept a disappearance that does not resemble ordinary disappearance. Most of the universe has slipped away, but not by vanishing from every image at once. It has slipped away in the stronger sense of leaving the category of eventual reciprocity. It remains there, in some cases still visible, still measurable, still beautiful, and yet no longer part of any future in which we and it can affect one another on terms recognizable as encounter. And that leaves us in a very peculiar kind of universe. Not empty, not silent in the simple sense, not lacking in grandeur, but arranged so that grandeur and isolation grow together. The larger the scale, the less the old dream of one connected cosmos survives. Even before you worry about propulsion, life support, biology, or engineering, the expansion has already done part of the closing work for you. It has taken much of the universe and shifted it from someday perhaps to no longer. So when people say the universe is expanding, the statement can sound almost cheerful, as if space were generously making room for everything. In a human room, more space often means freedom. On cosmic scales, more space can mean exile, more separation, more delay, more of the universe receding into the category of things that can still be seen, only because their older light has not yet finished telling us goodbye. And once you realize that, the next step is unavoidable. Distance is no longer just a static obstacle. Expansion is what turns distance into exile. The word distance is almost too mild for what the expanding universe does. Distance sounds passive. Two places are far apart, and that is unfortunate, but at least the gap itself is not choosing sides. It is simply there, waiting to be crossed badly or well, depending on your tools. Exile is different. Exile means separation that continues to work against reunion. Separation that becomes part of your condition. Separation that is not just large, but increasingly final. That is why expansion matters so much to this story. It takes a universe that is already difficult and makes it progressively less forgiving. It turns remoteness into something colder than remoteness. At first glance, this can be hard to feel because expansion does not look dramatic in the ordinary sense. Nothing in your room is stretching away from you. The Earth is not being torn from the sun. The moon is not vanishing between one evening and the next. Your local world remains local. Gravity still holds many structures together. At human scale, and even at the scale of a solar system or a galaxy, life can proceed without every daily thought being dominated by cosmic expansion. That is part of why the subject can seem like a distant technical detail, a line in a textbook about the large-scale behavior of the universe and not much more. But that quietness is misleading. Expansion is gentle only where gravity is strong enough, and distances are modest enough to resist it. Beyond those protected islands, the universe behaves very differently. Space itself grows. The separation between very distant regions increases, and it increases in a way that can outrun any hope of future exchange. That last part is the one that matters. A static gap is a challenge. A growing gap can become a refusal. It helps to separate two ideas that are often confused. When people hear that distant galaxies are receding, they often imagine them moving through space away from us like debris from an explosion. That picture is understandable, but it hides the real problem. The deeper issue is not that galaxies are simply choosing directions and racing off into a pre-existing empty arena. The issue is that the arena itself is changing. More space comes between far regions over time. So when we talk about remote galaxies becoming unreachable, it is not always because they are behaving like spacecraft that exceeded our chase speed. It is because the space between us and them is not holding still while light tries to cross it. That distinction matters because it explains why the problem is so absolute. If this were only a matter of objects moving fast through a fixed background, one could always imagine some future machine catching up under favourable conditions. Maybe not easily, maybe not soon, but in principle, the route would still exist. Expansion changes the category of the problem. It means the route itself can become a losing proposition. The messenger is not just trying to cover an enormous distance. It is trying to cover an enormous distance while the definition of the distance keeps changing in the wrong direction. On smaller scales, this sounds manageable. If a destination drifts a little while you travel, then perhaps you adjust your course and continue. But the universe is not offering a little drift. On the larger scales, it is offering a geometry that can make the journey fundamentally hopeless. There are regions from which old light can still be arriving, while any new signal sent now will never bridge the ever-growing gulf. That is where the language of exile begins to feel deserved. These places have not merely remained far from us. They have been carried into a condition where shared future becomes impossible. This is one of the strangest facts modern cosmology has handed us, because it clashes so badly with ordinary experience. In ordinary life, more time usually means more opportunity. If a destination is far away, then more time gives you a better chance of reaching it. If a relationship is strained, more time allows repair. If knowledge is incomplete, more time allows discovery. We are trained by life on Earth to think of time as the ally of eventual connection. Enough patience, enough effort, enough years, and perhaps the gap can be narrowed. Cosmic expansion tells a different story. Sometimes more time means less opportunity. Sometimes waiting does not preserve possibility, it consumes it. That is a deeply unfriendly rule from a human perspective. We like the idea that doors remain open if we are merely persistent enough. The expanding universe says that some doors close while you're still deciding whether to walk toward them. Not metaphorically, physically, causally. The relation between regions changes, and with that change, the meaning of future contact changes as well. There is a temptation to ask whether this is only important for absurdly remote galaxies that no one was realistically going to visit anyway. In a practical engineering sense, yes, the effect becomes most brutal at large distances. But the emotional and philosophical significance is much broader. It tells us what kind of universe we live in. It tells us that the cosmos is not one patient stage waiting for intelligence to mature and spread until all becomes connected. It tells us instead that the large-scale universe is sorting itself into zones of lasting relation and zones of permanent separation. Some structures remain part of the same broad future, others do not. That sorting process is what makes exile the right word. Exile is not just being far from home, it is being cut off from return, from participation, from ordinary reciprocity. It is the difference between a long road and a closed border. Expansion creates cosmic closed borders, and unlike human borders, these are not maintained by policy or law or fear or bureaucracy. They are maintained by space-time itself. No negotiation touches them, no treaty softens them, no act of courage makes them polite. Once a region has slipped beyond meaningful future exchange, it does not matter how badly one wishes to know it, to warn it, to join it, or to be joined by it. Physics has already cast its vote. There is something especially hard about accepting this because the visible universe encourages the opposite emotional conclusion. When we look outward with telescopes, we do not see a sparse prison with obvious walls. We see richness almost beyond bearing. galaxies in clusters, galaxies behind galaxies, light from ancient structures still pouring in. The sky in deep images becomes crowded to the point of absurdity. The first reaction is abundance. The second reaction is possibility. It looks like a place that should reward boldness. But sight is only part of the story. The deeper question is not what is visible. It is what remains causally available. That is a harsher filter. Many things can be visible without being available in any future sense that matters. A photograph of a person is visible after they are gone. Ruins are visible after the civilization that built them has ended. Starlight is visible long after the state that emitted it has changed. In the same way, galaxies can remain visible to us while already belonging to a domain from which no new mutuality can emerge. That turns observation into a slightly painful privilege. We are allowed to witness more of the universe than we are allowed to join. This becomes even more severe once you remember that expansion is not merely continuing, it is accelerating. That means the estrangement grows stronger with time. The large-scale universe is not moving toward easier reunion. It is moving toward deeper isolation. Distant galaxies do not merely stay distant. Their practical connection to us weakens further. The future does not widen into universal contact. It narrows into local company surrounded by increasing irrelevance. This has an odd consequence for the meaning of scientific knowledge. Science gives us the power to understand structures we can never influence. That is one of its great triumphs. We can reconstruct the history of the early universe, infer the existence of dark matter, study galaxies billions of years in the past, and map a cosmos whose sheer size defeats ordinary language. But knowledge here does not imply entry. In fact, the better we understand the large-scale universe, the more clearly we see the terms of our confinement. Cosmology is a map of both revelation and exclusion. It tells us not only what is there, but what there means under the rule that light is slow and space is stretching. And this brings us to a difficult correction of a very old human habit. We often imagine history as a story of increasing connectedness. Villages become regions, regions become nations. Nations become a planet linked by trade, flight, satellites, and networks. By this pattern, it feels natural to assume that the future continues in the same direction. One world becomes many worlds, then many worlds become a stellar civilization, then galaxies join a larger conversation. The circles keep widening. The logic of expansion in human history seduces us into expecting expansion of participation in cosmic history. The universe does not cooperate with that expectation. Its own expansion works against our kind of expansion. As intelligence grows capable of larger ambitions, the large-scale cosmos is already becoming less hospitable to the dream of shared totality. The farther outward you look, the less the old model of growing connectedness applies. Local connectedness may increase. A solar system might one day become tightly linked. Nearby stars might perhaps be joined by very patient projects. But on the grandest scales, the current runs the other way. The universe is not integrating. It is differentiating into islands with horizons. This is why the idea can feel more upsetting than mere distance. Distance alone still allows hope of slow conquest. Exile does not. Exile says that what lies beyond may remain real, but not for you in the full sense. It may influence your understanding. It may send old light. It may occupy your thoughts and fill your telescopes and reshape your philosophy, but it does not belong to the field of things with which you can still build a common future. That phrase, common future, is really the heart of the matter. A place can be physically real and scientifically important and yet absent from your common future. We are used to thinking of the universe as one future because we speak of the future of the universe, but that is a very detached way of speaking, the way a physicist might speak of matter and time in general. For living beings, futures are always local. They are built from what can still affect and be affected, what can still answer and be answered, what can still be warned, reached, joined, or mourned in a timely way. Expansion reduces the scale on which such futures can be shared. It does so unevenly, which is what makes the picture so strange. Our local group of galaxies remains gravitationally bound. The Milky Way, Andromeda, and their smaller companions still belong to one long-term family of motion. This can make it tempting to think that expansion is not such a serious jailer after all. After all, plenty remains nearby. Plenty remains accessible in principle, but the exception should not distract from the rule. The local group is not the model for the universe. It is the sheltered corner. It is what remains when gravity wins locally against a much broader tendency towards separation. And that broader tendency is relentless. Beyond the local group, galaxy clusters and superclusters do not all remain loyal to one shared future. Many are already receding into a state where the practical meaning of relationship decays. The universe becomes, on the larger scales, less like a single country, and more like a collection of provinces drifting apart with no roads being built between them, only longer and longer delays laid down by the growth of space itself. This has consequences not just for travel, but for meaning. Meaning in the social and historical sense depends on timing. A warning means something because it arrives before the danger fully unfolds. A treaty means something because both sides can still act while the same conditions hold. A story means something because speaker and listener remain connected enough in circumstance to share its world. Once delays grow too large, the same objects survive in weaker form. The warning becomes a historical note. The treaty becomes a curiosity. The story becomes a document from a civilization whose present never overlapped with yours. Expansion takes the machinery of shared meaning and starves it of simultaneity. That is why exile is not merely a dramatic word. It describes a loss of participation, not just the inability to arrive somewhere, but the inability to matter there while it is still there in any relevant sense. And if you imagine civilizations scattered through the cosmos, the result is even more severe. Each one would inhabit a shrinking sphere of practical relation. Its telescopes might reveal grandeur beyond that sphere, but its actions would remain trapped inside a local bubble of timely consequence. It could think about the universe. It could model the universe. It could perhaps infer that many other bubbles exist. Yet bubble is the right image. The larger reality would not become a common public square. It would be partitioned by horizons. This is perhaps the sharpest break between the dream of the universe and the reality of the universe. The dream says intelligence wakes up, spreads, and eventually joins the cosmos. The reality says intelligence wakes up inside a local causal chamber, learns that the chamber has walls made not of matter but of delay, and then discovers that those walls are tightening on the larger scales because expansion is carrying more and more of reality into the category of permanent outside. That should not make local life feel meaningless. If anything, it does the opposite. It makes local company more important. It raises the value of whatever remains inside mutual reach. Home worlds, neighbouring planets, nearby stars, the local group, whatever domain still lies within the range of shared future. These are not merely stepping stones towards something larger. They may be the entire serious stage on which reciprocity can ever take place. The universe outside remains magnificent, but magnificence is not the same as a relationship. So expansion does not simply add more empty space to an already big universe. It changes the moral temperature of distance. It makes remoteness harder, not softer. It takes what might once have been imagined as very long journeys and recasts them as departures into one-way history. It takes the neutral language of far away and turns it into the colder language of beyond return. And once you really accept that, another thought follows almost immediately. If the large-scale universe is partitioning itself this way, then any civilization that arises anywhere is not merely lonely because the cosmos is big. It is lonely because it lives in one sealed domain of timely experience, with the rest of reality increasingly relegated to delayed spectacle. In that sense, every civilization wherever it appears grows up not in one shared universe, but in its own locked room. Once you stop imagining the universe as one open stage and start seeing it as a structure divided by delay, a very uncomfortable possibility comes into view. Perhaps the great loneliness of the cosmos does not come mainly from the absence of other minds. Perhaps it comes from the fact that minds, wherever they appear, are trapped inside the same physical arrangement. Every civilization may begin with the same hopeful instinct. It looks up, sees a sky full of stars, and assumes that the larger world is out there waiting. Then sooner or later it learns the rules. Light is the fastest thing there is. Space is not modestly large, but outrageously large. Time does not pause while messages travel. Expansion makes the far universe less available, not more. And with that, the old picture changes. The civilization does not live in a shared cosmic commons. It lives in a room. Locked room is not meant here as a theatrical phrase. I do not mean that civilizations are literally enclosed by visible walls, nor that some cosmic jailer has sealed the exits and hidden the key in a drawer marked strictly impossible. The room is made from timing. It is the region inside which action and response can still belong to something like one living present. Outside that region, the universe still exists, but it stops being a place of ordinary participation. It becomes observation, speculation, archaeology, or fantasy. The room is not the whole universe, that is the point. The room is the tiny fraction of the universe that can still answer back on terms a civilization could use. That idea changes how one should think about intelligence itself. We often ask whether there are other civilizations out there, as though the answer must come in two neat boxes. Either the universe is empty and we are alone, or it is populated and we are not alone. But there is a third possibility that may be much closer to the truth. The universe could be populated in some broad statistical sense, and still leave every civilization effectively isolated. The loneliness would not come from rare life alone. It would come from the fact that each centre of intelligence develops inside a causal chamber so limited that the rest of the cosmos remains mostly outside practical exchange. That is a much stranger kind of loneliness than the simple old empty universe story. An empty universe is sad in an uncomplicated way. A populated universe divided into locked rooms is sad in a more specific and much sharper way. It suggests that company may exist and still fail to become company. It suggests that the tragedy is not only scarcity, but separation. Somewhere there may be other beings worrying about the same questions, building their own instruments, developing their own physics, arguing over policy, making bad decisions, inventing religions, writing love letters, composing songs, misplacing tools, growing old, trying to understand whether they are alone, and all the while remaining sealed behind delays so large that the fact of their existence changes almost nothing in the practical life of our world. That is a harder thought to carry than simple emptiness, because it contains a kind of unreachable nearness. Not near in distance, perhaps not even near in time, but near in the sense that the same drama may be repeating elsewhere under other skies. The universe may be full of locked rooms with lights on inside, and it is worth noticing what kind of locked room this is. It is not small in any ordinary way. A civilization's room may include a planet, a solar system, perhaps several systems, perhaps some wider local network if it becomes patient and technologically capable enough. The room could still contain vast resources, astonishing beauty, and more complexity than any species could fully exhaust. The phrase locked room should not be mistaken for total confinement to a single point. The prison of light can still grant large cells, but large is not the same as open. A palace can still be locked. A continent can still be cut off. A civilization can have room to move and still have no road to the larger universe that preserves the ordinary meaning of relationship. This is where the dream of cosmic community runs into trouble. People like to imagine that a mature civilization, given enough time, would naturally spread outward and eventually join a broader network of minds. It is a very human assumption, and not an irrational one. On Earth, expansion of knowledge usually leads to wider circles of contact. Better ships connected continents. Better communication connected nations. Satellites and fibre optics connected a planet. So it feels natural to project the pattern upward. Better propulsion, better energy systems, better engineering, perhaps better biology or artificial intelligence, and the result should be the same on a grander scale. The isolated world becomes part of the stars become part of the galaxy becomes part of something larger. But that projection quietly assumes that the scale of the arena remains small relative to the maximum speed at which cause and effect can spread. That was true on Earth. It stops being true in the cosmos. Once the distances become huge compared with the speed limit, wider knowledge does not automatically generate wider participation. It may generate only wider awareness of confinement. A civilization can discover the universe and still fail to enter it in the old social sense. It can grow wiser and become more trapped at the same time, at least in its understanding. There is a sober kind of comedy in that. One can imagine a sufficiently intelligent species inventing astronomy, learning the size of its galaxy, measuring the speed of light, making its first proud statements about joining the wider cosmos, and then spending a few centuries realizing that what it has really discovered is the dimensions of its own room. A grand scientific awakening followed by a long, quiet, collective pause. Not despair exactly. More the realization that the marketing department got ahead of the engineering, and the engineering got ahead of the physics. The room also changes what civilization means internally. Even before you worry about alien contact, a species that spreads beyond its home world begins to confront the same rule within itself. A settlement on another planet is not just a branch office with a scenic horizon. It exists under delayed exchange. A settlement around another star, if such a thing ever happens, is still more delayed. As distance grows, a civilization does not merely enlarge. It fragments into regions with different local presence. The larger it becomes, the less it behaves like one fluid society, and the more it behaves like a set of relatives separated by time. That is important, because the locked room is not always a single planet. It can be a whole local sphere of mutual relevance. Inside that sphere there may be trade, conversation, politics, migration, and shared history. But beyond some radius, the delays become too severe. At that point, the larger civilization stops being a living whole and starts becoming a historical family. Shared origins remain. Shared myths remain. Shared records may continue to move between branches, yet active unity weakens. Command becomes late. Coordination becomes late. Rescue becomes late. Even sympathy becomes strangely archival, because by the time one part of the system learns what another part has suffered, the suffering belongs to a past that could not be interrupted. So the locked room may contain many doors inside it, but the outer door remains shut. This has consequences for how we should think about intelligence in the universe. Intelligence is often imagined as a force that overcomes local constraint. Minds learn, plan, invent, and therefore escape. There is truth in that. Intelligence absolutely can transform conditions. It can turn a dangerous planet into a livable one. It can turn raw materials into machines, patterns into prediction, guesswork into science. But intelligence does not automatically repeal every limit. Sometimes it does something stranger. It clarifies the limit with such precision that escape becomes less plausible, not more. Cosmology may be the greatest example of that. The smarter we become about the universe, the clearer the boundaries of meaningful access appear. That does not make science pessimistic. It makes it honest. A child may imagine the sea as a blue edge one can simply keep crossing forever. A navigator learns where currents, storms, fuel, and human endurance become decisive. The navigator knows more, and therefore sees both more possibility and more structure. In the same way, a civilization that understands its universe sees that the room is real. That recognition may be disappointing, but it is also mature. It replaces fantasy with scale. There is another reason the locked room idea matters. It may help explain why the universe can seem so quiet, without requiring that life be impossibly rare. Silence has many causes. There may be no one there. There may be no one nearby. There may be life, but not intelligence. There may be intelligence, but not long-lived technology. There may be technology, but no desire to broadcast. All of those are possible. Yet even if many of those barriers are overcome, the physics of separation remains. Civilizations may simply be too confined to produce the kind of loud, overlapping galactic conversation people casually imagine. The rooms may be occupied but poorly connected. Think of an apartment building in which every flat is deeply insulated, the corridors are impossibly long, and sound travels only after ridiculous delays. If you sit in one room and hear nothing, that does not prove the building is empty. It may prove only that the architecture is hostile to ordinary neighbourliness. The universe may be like that on a grand scale. Not a warm village square, but a structure in which signals travel badly relative to the size of the place. Each room might contain a drama intense enough to fill entire histories, and still the building as a whole would feel quiet. This also means that even success in finding another civilization would not necessarily free us from the locked room. Detection is not the same as entry. Suppose tomorrow we discovered a clear sign of intelligence far away. The discovery would be world-changing. It would alter philosophy, religion, politics, and our sense of human uniqueness. But it would not automatically produce community. If the signal came from a great distance, then the relation might remain one of delayed witness. We would know that another room was occupied. We would still be in our own. That may sound deflating, but it is not trivial. Knowing that another room is occupied matters. It may change how a civilization understands itself. It may introduce humility, comfort, fear, rivalry, or a strange form of solidarity. Yet solidarity at cosmic distance can become a very abstract thing. The other beings remain beyond timely aid, beyond ordinary conversation, beyond shared risk, beyond the practical forms of togetherness that make solidarity robust in daily life. We might care about them deeply, while remaining unable to do much more than care, and the same would be true from their side if they existed and knew of us. Mutual awareness would not abolish the walls, it would only make the walls emotionally sharper. This is why every civilization lives in its own locked room, and also carries its own local illusion of centrality. Not because it is foolish, but because the room is where consequences happen. Inside the room, the nearby world is everything that matters in time. The local star, local planets, local history, local threats, local resources, local beauty, local catastrophes, local politics. That is where life unfolds responsively. Outside the room lies the larger universe, but mostly in forms that cannot interrupt local urgency fast enough to compete with it. So naturally every civilization's serious life remains local, even if its curiosity becomes cosmic. One can imagine how this shapes culture. There might be myths of distant company, dreams of escape, projects aimed at crossing the room's outer boundary, political movements arguing over how much to spend on messages to the unreachable, schools teaching children that the stars are our future, philosophers warning that the stars are not our future but our mirror. There may be optimists insisting that cleverness will beat the limit and pessimists insisting that the room is the whole truth. All of that feels plausible because it resembles us. The locked room does not end debate, it creates it. And perhaps there is something faintly comforting in that. If the room is real, then every civilization confronting it may develop the same arguments, the same hopes, the same late-night discomfort when someone explains the speed of light too clearly. Somewhere, perhaps, another species is also having to learn that visibility is not access, that a galaxy is not a neighbourhood, that the wider universe can be known and still remain unavailable in the ordinary sense. They too may be trying to decide whether to interpret that as tragedy, discipline, challenge, or simply weather. Still, the room has one effect that should not be overlooked. it increases the importance of whatever lies inside it. If the cosmos is not an open highway, but a set of local chambers, then the beings within each chamber matter more to one another than any romantic cosmic language usually admits. The nearest world becomes more important. The neighbouring habitat becomes more important. The local branch of life, however strange, becomes more important. Responsibility becomes local, not because local things are philosophically superior, but because they are where timing still works. Moral urgency lives where response is still possible. That is a useful correction to certain kinds of grand cosmic thinking. It is easy to speak of humanity's destiny among the stars while neglecting the small and immediate obligations on Earth. But if the universe is mostly locked rooms, then there is no larger forum waiting to excuse our failures here. No vast common civilization is around the corner to absorb our mistakes into some bigger progress. The room we are in is where our decisions matter first and most. The distant universe remains worth studying, worth admiring, worth trying to approach in whatever limited ways physics allows, but not at the expense of forgetting where reciprocity still lives. The locked room also makes the idea of escape more complicated, because once a civilization understands the room, it naturally begins looking for loopholes. Faster travel, faster communication, wormholes, new physics, strange topologies of space-time, methods of preserving identity across absurd timescales, schemes for turning generations into stepping stones. Some of these may remain fantasy, some may become partial practical strategies. The desire itself is easy to understand. No intelligent species would learn the dimensions of its confinement and simply nod with gratitude. The urge to test the walls is almost guaranteed, but even that urge is shaped by the room. The more honestly you think about the problem, the more escape begins to look less like a triumphant breakthrough, and more like a confrontation with what sort of universe this really is. Are the walls absolute or only nearly absolute? Are there cracks, or just hopeful drawings of cracks? Is cosmic isolation a technical problem, a deep law, or some mixture of both? These questions do not arise in a universe that feels like an open frontier. They arise in one that has already started to feel like architecture, and that is where the next part of the story naturally goes, because once a civilization realizes it lives inside a locked room, the mind does what minds always do. It walks to the wall, places a hand on it, and starts asking whether this really is the end of the road, or whether somewhere in all of physics there might still be a way through. Once a civilization begins to understand the size and structure of its confinement, it does what every intelligent thing seems to do when faced with a boundary. It starts looking for a way around it. That reaction is so natural that it almost feels like part of intelligence itself. A wall appears, and the mind immediately begins to ask whether the wall is real, whether it only looks solid, whether there is a door, a tunnel, a weakness, a loophole, a neglected technicality, or perhaps just a poorly supervised corner where the laws of nature are not paying full attention. This is the dream of escape. It is not merely a scientific dream, it is emotional, civilizational, almost spiritual in some cases. If the universe is vast and full of worlds and histories and possible company, then surely some route must exist by which intelligence can do more than sit in its local chamber and admire the rest from a distance. Surely the cosmos did not produce curiosity only to strand it on isolated islands. Surely the same species that learned to cross oceans, deserts, mountain ranges, and the vacuum between Earth and the Moon is not meant to stop forever at the threshold of the stars. That feeling is not childish. It is one of the nobler instincts we have. It is the refusal to let the first reading of a limit become the last reading. So civilizations dream. They dream of engines that push harder than any engine before. They dream of ships that cross the dark between stars in a single lifetime. They dream of suspended sleep, of generation ships, of minds uploaded into machines patient enough to wait for centuries, of folded space, bent geometry, artificial gateways, hidden dimensions, and all the other magnificent evasions that thought invents when the direct path looks too cruel to accept. Science fiction has spent generations exploring these evasions not only because they are entertaining, though they are, but because they answer a very old ache. They preserve the idea that the universe might still open if only we become clever enough. And for a long time, even serious scientific thinking can share a little of that mood. There is always another concept to inspect, another interpretation to test, another edge case in the equations, another unbuilt machine, another distant possibility not yet fully excluded. One of the great strengths of science is precisely that it does not surrender too quickly. It allows imagination to work on the problem. It asks which barriers are merely technological and which are structural. It keeps the dream alive long enough to learn what kind of dream it really is. The difficulty is that the wall does not become kinder under examination. It becomes clearer. At the heart of the problem is a deeply unfriendly fact. The speed of light is not just a speed we have not yet learned to exceed. It sits inside the structure of modern physics as the limiting speed for the propagation of influence through space-time. That is a much harsher role. It means the wall is not merely a current engineering embarrassment. It is woven into the grammar of how causes and effects are allowed to relate. One can imagine approaching the limit. One can imagine making astonishing use of the limit, but one cannot casually imagine stepping past it without beginning to tamper with the architecture of the theory itself. And theories do not surrender architecture lightly. This is one reason the dream of escape repeatedly shifts from hard engineering towards speculative geometry. Once people realize that simple acceleration does not solve the problem, the imagination starts looking for ways not to cross space in the ordinary sense at all. If the wall blocks straightforward motion, then perhaps motion is the wrong category. Perhaps space-time can be folded. Perhaps shortcuts can exist. Perhaps distant points can be joined by tunnels. Perhaps the path can be changed rather than the traveller. These ideas have a special charm because they seem to preserve the ambition while avoiding the blunt refusal of the speed limit. They say, in effect, perhaps the universe is legalistic rather than truly closed. Perhaps it can be outwitted. There is an undeniable beauty in that hope. The trouble is that every proposed loophole tends to come wrapped in terms that sound less like engineering and more like bargaining with extremely stern mathematics. Wormholes are fascinating to think about, but keeping such structures open appears to demand forms of matter or energy, with properties far outside anything we know how to handle in ordinary life. Warp-style ideas are intriguing on paper, but they quickly run into equally severe questions about energy, stability, and whether the constructions represent something nature would ever actually permit, rather than something equations can briefly tolerate under fantastically artificial assumptions. The farther one pursues these dreams, the more they stop looking like the next stage after rockets and start looking like requests for the universe to rewrite its own habits. That does not mean one should mock them. Speculation has value. Some of the best science begins with a question that sounds a little impertinent, but there is a difference between healthy speculation and wishful misreading. At present, the wall remains the better supported reality. We have many stories about bypassing it, and no confirmed road through it. So perhaps, one says, the problem is not crossing the wall in a single leap. Perhaps escape can still happen slowly. Perhaps the stars do not require shortcuts so much as patience. A species could build ships that travel more slowly than light, but still fast enough to reach nearby systems over long spans. It could send sleeping passengers, frozen embryos, autonomous factories, digital mines, or generation ships carrying whole artificial societies that live and die en route. None of this breaks the speed limit. None of it asks physics for a miracle. It asks instead for endurance, organization, and a willingness to treat time itself as part of the vehicle. This is where the dream becomes more serious, and in some ways more haunting. Because slower escape may indeed be physically less absurd than faster than light escape. One can imagine patient expansion by means that do not violate known principles, Yet even here, the wall has not disappeared. It has only changed shape. The journey may be possible, but the connected civilization begins to unravel under the weight of the delay. A generation ship does not carry a living conversation with home. It carries a severed future. A probe sent to another star does not remain part of one fluid society. It becomes the start of another local history. Even if humans or their descendants spread outward this way, they do not thereby abolish the locked rooms, they reproduce them. Each new star becomes another chamber, perhaps linked by memory, perhaps by long-delayed records, but still governed by the same slow causality. This is an important correction to the dream of escape. Reaching a new place is not the same as escaping the prison of a light. You may move from one cell to another, or enlarge the occupied territory within the prison, without ever reaching a universe of timely openness. Expansion is not freedom if every newly reached world is still isolated by the same wall from every other on scales that matter to lived experience. That can sound discouraging, but it is simply the honest distinction between migration and liberation. Even the most optimistic, plausible future under known physics does not obviously produce the kind of cosmos people usually imagine when they speak of becoming a starfaring civilization. It may produce a branching species, or a family of descendants, or a network of archives and long memory projects, or a scatter of inhabited systems, each living mostly in its own present. Those are not small achievements. In fact, they would be among the most extraordinary things any life form had ever done. Yet they are still not the same as walking through the wall. They are ways of living with the wall. There is another subtlety here that often gets missed. Approaching the speed of light may make the journey feel shorter for travellers under certain circumstances, but it does not rescue the wider structure of isolation. This is one of those places where a technically interesting fact can be emotionally misunderstood. Yes, a ship moving at extraordinary speed may experience the passage of time differently from those who remain behind. That can make distant voyages more survivable from the point of view of the people aboard. But this is not a free gift of closeness. It is trade. The travellers may protect their own experience of duration, while surrendering synchronization with the civilization they left. Home ages on. History continues elsewhere. Communication remains delayed. The wall shifts from one aspect of life to another, but it does not politely step aside and allow the universe to become a village. In a way, that makes the dream of near-light travel even sadder. You can sometimes save the traveller from the full burden of distance, but not the shared present. The ship may arrive, the old world may already be gone, the mission may succeed, the society that launched it may no longer exist in recognisable form. The wall is merciful in one direction and merciless in another. This is the pattern again and again. Every apparent concession nature offers comes with a hidden invoice. Yes, you may travel but not remain synchronized. Yes, you may observe but not participate. Yes, you may spread but not remain one ordinary civilization. Yes, you may dream of grand connection, but the speed of a light continues to ration how much of that dream can become mutual reality. At this point, a civilization has a choice in temperament. It can respond with denial, insisting that some breakthrough must be waiting just beyond current understanding because the alternative feels too grim. It can respond with despair, deciding that if universal freedom is impossible, then local life has somehow been diminished. Or it can respond in a third way, which is perhaps the most difficult. It can take the wall seriously without turning it into melodrama. It can say, very well, the universe is not open in the way we hoped. Then what remains worth doing inside the structure we actually have? That question is not defeatist, it is a form of maturity. A species that accepts the wall does not have to stop building. It does not have to stop exploring. It does not have to stop sending probes, imagining new habitats, studying exoplanets, or trying every physically honest method of reaching beyond its birthplace. But it does need to stop confusing all those ambitions with liberation from cosmic isolation. The ambitions remain valuable, the language around them becomes more sober. One no longer says we will conquer the universe. One says we will learn how much of it can still enter into a real future with us, and how gracefully we can inhabit that fraction. That may sound smaller, but smaller is not always lesser. Sometimes smaller is more exact. A surgeon does not become less admirable by giving up dreams of immortality and focusing instead on what can actually be healed. In the same way, a civilization does not become less noble by letting go of fantasies of unlimited cosmic access and turning its intelligence toward the local domain where action still matters. In fact, accepting the wall may improve how a civilization thinks. Frontier fantasies can encourage carelessness. They make it easy to imagine that every present failure can be redeemed later by outward expansion, that every ecological wound can be escaped, that every political stupidity can be outgrown somewhere else under another sun. But if the wall is real, then the places within mutual reach matter more, not less. Home matters more. Nearby worlds matter more. Preservation matters more. Long-term stewardship matters more. The locked room becomes not an excuse for despair, but a reason to take the room seriously. Still, the dream of escape does not die easily, and perhaps it should not. There is a healthy version of it that continues to test the limits without lying about them. Physics advances precisely because people ask stubborn questions. Could space-time admit structures we do not yet understand? Are there phenomena in extreme regimes that alter our practical options? Can information be used more cleverly? Can matter be organized more patiently? Can life itself be reshaped to survive timescales that would make present humanity feel faint? These are fair questions. The wall should be investigated from every side. But the mood of the investigation matters. One investigates a wall differently once one suspects it is load-bearing for the entire building. And that is perhaps the deepest challenge here. The wall may not be an unfortunate add-on to reality. It may be part of what reality is. The same structure that frustrates our dreams of cosmic togetherness may also be bound up with the order that makes stars stable, causes coherent, and physics intelligible. We are tempted to treat the speed limit as a prison feature and nothing more, but it may also be a consistency feature. Remove it carelessly, and the whole world may stop making the kind of sense required for any civilization to exist in the first place. There is a quiet irony in that. The wall we resent may be one of the things that made us possible. The prison bars may also be support beams. That does not make them less confining, but it does change the emotional register. We are not simply trapped by a malicious universe. We are living inside a universe whose very coherence may demand the same rules that isolate its inhabitants from one another on large scales. Order and loneliness may be related. The price of a cosmos that hangs together logically may be that it does not hang together socially across arbitrary distance. Once you see that possibility, the dream of escape becomes more complicated. To ask for freedom from the wall is no longer just to ask for a faster ship. It is to ask whether the universe can remain itself while granting the kind of openness we desire. That is a much more serious question, and one that present knowledge does not answer in our favour. So perhaps the most honest position is neither to worship the wall nor to pretend it will surely fall. It is to live in tension with it, to keep testing, to keep imagining, to keep building every honest bridge that physics allows, but also to stop speaking as though the rest of the cosmos were simply waiting for us to become worthy of it. Much of it is not waiting at all. Much of it is separated in principle, or in practice so severely that principle barely matters. And even where travel remains imaginable, the wall ensures that every arrival comes with loss attached. That is the shape of the dream once it has grown up. It is no longer a dream of easy conquest. It becomes a dream of partial reach, local courage, patient engineering, and clear-eyed acceptance that some horizons are not invitations, they are boundaries. There is something almost tender in that acceptance. Not cheerful exactly, but calmer. The universe stops being a taunt and starts being a place with terms. We do not like the terms. We test them. We argue with them. We write novels against them. We invent propulsion concepts at 3 in the morning and annoy our descendants with impossible optimism. Yet the terms remain, and after all the dreams of escape have had their say, what remains most striking is not that the universe is empty or mean, but that it is quiet in a very particular way, full of light, full of structure, full of distant histories, and yet arranged so that the silence between those histories is not accidental. It is built into the speed at which anything can ever matter to anything else. By the time you arrive at this point, the universe has changed shape a little. Not physically, of course. The stars have not rearranged themselves because we took a slower and less flattering look at them. The galaxies are not offended. The speed of light has not written in to defend its reputation. But the picture in the mind has shifted. What once looked open now looks partitioned. What once looked like a frontier now looks more like a set of distant compartments. What once sounded like adventure now comes with a long pause before the next reply. And that may be the most honest way to describe the universe at large. Not empty but quiet. Not simple but separated. Not lacking in wonder, but arranged so that wonder and isolation are tied together much more tightly than human beings usually like to admit. There is a very old habit in the way we talk about the cosmos. We speak of the stars as if they are waiting to be reached, waiting to be mapped properly, waiting to become part of the expanding circle of meaningful human life. It is the same habit that once turned seas into routes, mountains into crossings, and continents into future neighbours. On Earth, that habit was often rewarded. Distances that once seemed impossible became difficult, then expensive, then ordinary. So the instinct survives. Faced with the night sky, we assume that the same pattern is merely unfinished on a larger scale. The trouble is that the universe does not behave like a larger Earth. It behaves like something much stricter. Light is fast enough to make local life feel immediate and slow enough to make the cosmos feel broken into separate times. That combination is what creates the quiet. It is not the quiet of total silence. It is the quiet of delayed existence. Everything out there is speaking in old light. Everything distant is arriving late. The larger the scale, the less the universe resembles one shared present, and the more it resembles a collection of histories being delivered out of order. That is a strange kind of quiet because it does not look quiet at first glance. Look at the sky from a dark place and it seems full. Modern astronomy only intensifies that impression. There are stars everywhere, planets everywhere, galaxies beyond count, light from epochs so old that it began its journey before our species existed in anything like its current form. The universe appears rich to the point of excess. It almost seems rude to call such a place quiet. Quiet compared with what? Quiet measured by which standard? There is so much going on, and that is exactly the difficulty. Activity is not the same as accessibility. Richness is not the same as company. A city can be full of people and still feel lonely if the walls are thick enough. An office building can be busy on every floor and still feel silent if each room is sealed. The universe is not quiet because nothing happens. It is quiet because most of what happens does not happen within reach of timely response. The events are real. The stars burn, the planets turn, galaxies collide, black holes feed, civilizations perhaps rise and fall. But so much of it unfolds beyond the range where mutual presence can survive. That makes the quiet more unsettling than mere emptiness would have been. If the universe were empty, at least the sadness would be simple. We could say there is no one else, nothing else in the relevant sense, and that would be that. But a universe divided by light and time allows for a more difficult possibility. There may be others. There may be many others. There may be minds scattered across the dark, each one looking up and wondering the same thing, each one building instruments, each one discovering the same rules, each one feeling that same small shock when the numbers become too large to soften with optimism. And yet, The shared fact of being there together changes almost nothing about the practical shape of life. We remain divided not by ignorance alone, not by engineering alone, but by the way causality is rationed. It is one thing to be alone in a wilderness. It is another to live in a crowded structure where every door stays shut. That is the emotional truth behind the phrase separated by time and light. Time alone would already create distance of a certain kind. Light alone, as a finite messenger, would already impose delay. Together they do something more severe. They make every faraway place also a former place. You do not see it now. You see it then. You do not hear from it in the present. You hear from it after the fact. The universe does not merely spread things apart in space. It spreads them across different versions of now. Once that really settles in, the sky begins to look less like scenery and more like memory. Not memory in the sentimental sense, but memory in the physical sense. Every distant view is a record. Every star is shown to us as it was, not as it is in this moment. Every galaxy is a delayed report. Astronomy becomes the practice of reconstructing reality from messages that arrive late, because lateness is built into the structure of the world. That is still one of the most extraordinary things science has ever managed. It is hard not to admire the brilliance of a species that can sit on one small planet and infer the age, motion, composition, and history of objects it will never touch. But there is a sadness braided into that triumph. The better we get at reading the messages, the more obvious it becomes that most of them are not invitations. This is not a complaint against physics. Physics did not promise hospitality. It did not promise a universe built to reward the emotional preferences of conscious creatures. It merely describes what seems to be the case. And what seems to be the case is that large-scale reality is not organized for intimacy. It is organized for consistency. The speed limit may frustrate our stories about cosmic togetherness, but it also belongs to the rules that keep cause and effect from collapsing into nonsense. The same structure that preserves order may also preserve separation. That is not unfair. It is just indifferent. Human beings are not very comfortable with indifference on this scale. We tend to personify what frustrates us. We want the universe to be dramatic, to be cruel, to be teasing, to be symbolic, to be in some sense about us. But the silence between the stars is not personal. It is not a punishment. It is not a lesson designed for moral improvement. It is simply what happens when distances become enormous and the fastest thing there is remains finite. The quiet is not aimed at us. It would be there for anyone. In that sense, every civilization would inherit the same basic emotional problem. However strange its biology, however alien its language, however advanced its tools, it would still face the fact that large-scale reality comes in delayed fragments. It would still learn that seeing is not joining. It would still discover that most of the universe lies beyond the domain where warning, conversation, rescue, or ordinary exchange can survive. It too would have to decide how to live in a cosmos that reveals itself lavishly while withholding participation. That is why the subject feels larger than astronomy. It touches the question of what intelligence is for in a universe like this. If the cosmos is not open in the simple frontier sense, then curiosity does not lead only to conquest. It leads first to recognition. Recognition that the world is immense. Recognition that much of it can be understood but not inhabited. Recognition that knowledge and access are not the same gift. Recognition that the local sphere of actual mutual life may be far more important than cosmic daydreaming usually allows. That is not a small correction. It changes how ambition ought to sound. Ambition shaped by the old frontier myth speaks in terms of expansion without limit. It treats the stars as a future suburb of human life, the galaxy as a grand territory waiting to become social, the universe as a map to be filled in by courage and machinery. Ambition shaped by the quieter reality becomes more careful. It still wants to explore. It still wants to build, It still wants to reach other worlds where reaching remains honest. But it stops pretending that the whole cosmos is one eventual neighbourhood. It learns that maturity may consist not in conquering everything visible, but in understanding the scale of what can actually be shared. And what can be shared, though small compared with the universe, is not trivial. That is worth saying clearly, because otherwise the whole discussion can begin to sound more hopeless than it really is. A local world can still be astonishing. A solar system can still contain more work, danger, beauty and opportunity than any one civilization could exhaust. Nearby stars, however forbidding, still represent genuine destinations for imagination, science, and perhaps one day for machines or descendants patient enough to cross the dark. Even the local group of galaxies on the deepest timescales remains a kind of gravitational family. The quiet universe is not a tiny one. It is simply not socially continuous on the scales we once liked to romanticize. There is a practical wisdom hidden in that. It suggests that meaning is likely to remain local even when knowledge becomes cosmic. The beings who matter most to you will probably remain the beings within range of actual response. The worlds that matter most morally will remain the worlds whose futures can still be changed by your actions. The nearest forms of life, the nearest forms of suffering, the nearest forms of beauty, these will continue to outweigh the unreachable grandeur beyond the horizon, not because the horizon is unimportant, but because responsibility depends on timing. A distant galaxy may be magnificent. A nearby world in trouble can still call to you in time. That is one of the gentler lessons buried in this harsher picture. The prison of light does not merely tell us what we cannot do, it tells us where care still counts. It also gives the night sky a different kind of dignity. If the stars are not an easy future colony map, they are something else instead. They are evidence. Evidence of structure larger than ourselves, older than ourselves, more patient than ourselves, and not built for our convenience. There is value in that kind of encounter. A civilization that learns it is not standing at the centre of an open cosmic empire may become less arrogant. It may become more attentive. It may learn to distinguish between fantasy and scale. It may even become more grateful for the unlikely range within which mutual life is still possible. Gratitude may sound like an odd response to confinement, but perhaps it is not. There is something remarkable about existing at all in a universe where the rules are so severe. There is something remarkable about being able to look up from one small planet and understand any of this. The same species that complains, with some justice, that light is too slow on cosmic scales has also used that slow light to uncover the history of the universe itself. We are trapped in one sense, yes, but we are not blind. The room is locked, but it has windows, and the view is extraordinary. That does not solve the loneliness. It changes its texture. A lonely universe can still be known. A divided universe can still be admired. A quiet universe can still be filled with information, pattern, and surprise. The silence is not total because the light does arrive, however late. The messages are delayed, but they are not absent. We learn by waiting. We reconstruct by inference. We build stories from photons that left home before any human ear could have listened for them. There is something almost intimate in that, though not in the way we first wanted. The universe does not join us. It discloses itself in fragments. Perhaps that is enough for a different kind of relationship. Not the relationship of neighbours, not the relationship of equals meeting across a common square, but the relationship of witness. We are witnesses to a cosmos that will never become fully local. We are readers of messages that arrive from unreachable distances. We are interpreters of a world whose grandeur exceeds its hospitality. That may not be the heroic destiny many people wanted, but it is still a serious role, and it may be the role any honest civilization must learn to inhabit. To become wise in a universe like this might mean learning to hold two truths at once. The first is that most of reality lies beyond ordinary shared life. The second is that this does not strip reality of meaning. It simply relocates meaning. The cosmos remains worth studying even when it cannot be joined. Nearby life remains precious even when the stars refuse to become neighbours. Curiosity remains noble even when it discovers limits rather than permissions. So the universe is quiet. Quiet because light is finite. Quiet because time keeps everything out of sync. Quiet because distance does not just separate places but separates presence. Quiet because expansion takes much of the visible world and converts it from possible relation into one-way history. Quiet because every civilization, wherever it arises, is likely to hear mostly itself and the ancient light of things too far away to answer in time. But quiet is not the same as meaningless. A library is quiet. A museum is quiet. A sleeping city is quiet. Quiet can mean concentration. It can mean delay. It can mean that what is present requires patience rather than noise. The universe may be quiet in that sense. Not dead, not vacant, not barren, but waiting to be read carefully by creatures small enough to feel trapped and clever enough to understand why. And maybe that is the final adjustment. Not to stop dreaming, but to dream more honestly. Not to stop looking outward, but to look outward without pretending the stars owe us closeness. Not to stop imagining futures beyond Earth, but to build those futures with full awareness that distance and light will continue setting the terms. Not to stop wanting company, but to understand that company, where it exists, may remain mostly hidden behind time. If there are others out there, perhaps they too have learned this. Perhaps under some other sky, another mind has also realized that the universe is not one bright open road, but a scattered collection of lit rooms. Perhaps it has also understood that the silence between rooms is not accidental. Perhaps it has also found itself staring into the dark with a strange combination of disappointment and awe. And if that is true, then even here, inside our own little chamber of timely life, there is a faint comfort in the thought. Not that the walls are gone, not that the distance has softened, only that the experience of learning this may not belong to us alone. For now, though, all we really have is our own room, our own star, our own brief share of consciousness inside a universe that speaks slowly. The sky above us remains full of old light. The galaxies remain magnificent and remote. The speed of light remains impossibly fast for human life and painfully slow for the cosmos. The separation remains real. The quiet remains real. And somewhere inside that quiet on one small world, we are still here, still listening,